Ladies and gentlemen, today is June the 4th, and we are here to talk about world discussion. The world, basically. Agent Smith is going to be joining us in a few moments. We're going to talk about foreign policy, economics, history, current events, and all that good stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to weigh in the Twitch chat or in the comments after the fact. Without any further delays, let's jump into voice chat with Mr. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Good day, Sile.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. A little bit tired. I had to wake up early this morning, and my body's not used to that.
I can relate. Why did you have to get up?
Kind of working on a side project that's a little bit shrouded in secrecy right now, but it's a cool opportunity within the esports sphere.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. We'll say I get to work on some of my mindset advice muscles. That's your hint.
I wish I could have a cool, mysterious reason for having gotten up unusually early today.
It could be cool and mysterious.
No, it's just the dogs waking me up to feed them.
That's pretty mysterious. Why did they wake me up to feed this early? How early was it?
Well, it wasn't all that. I guess it was 9, 10 a.m.
Ooh, you woke up earlier than me.
Oh, really?
Early for me is like 10:35. I got up at 10:35 this morning, and I was like, ugh.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
I gave myself the opportunity to fall asleep and get 8 hours of sleep, so I got into bed at like 2:15, and I was like, look at me being responsible, giving myself the opportunity to rest. And then I just lay there in bed for like an hour, 2 hours. It's like, well, I guess I could have just gone to bed normal and just accept that I'm going to get less sleep, but so it goes.
So it goes.
Yep.
Well, I don't know what you've been doing the past couple weeks, but I've mostly just been house sitting.
Oh, nice. Your house or someone else's?
The first one was somebody else's. It was some friends, but after that, it was actually basically my house since my grandmother had to go to, well, she didn't have to. She was traveling, so I just watched the house. So, not too different than usual routine, but I have to get up to feed the dogs since they're used to getting fed, at like 9 a.m. or whenever.
Yeah.
When I'm normally asleep. So that took a little adjusting.
Yeah, they do say that the food clock is one of the strongest internal clocks of a creature.
Oh, I believe it.
There's light, which is like, can do with or without it. It can wake you up, and then there's sound, but the call of a meal is a very strong one.
Yeah, people got to have, well, I guess animals in general got to have their food.
Mm-hmm.
They get real antsy when they don't get it on time.
Yeah, last weekend I hung out with friends IRL. We went and got sushi and then played that Kingdom Death board game, and then we watched the new Super Mario movie.
Oh, how was that?
It was cute and pretty good, but not groundbreaking cinema or anything. I wasn't really a big Nintendo person. We never had a Nintendo or Super Nintendo or Nintendo 64 growing up, so I didn't really catch all the references, but my friends Jacob and Alicia, they were able to point out like, oh, this is that place or that's that place. So it was pretty nostalgic for people who have played a lot of Mario stuff. And then we played Mario Kart after, which was fun.
How very appropriate.
Yep.
Well, the real question is the new movie better than the original Super Mario Brothers movie?
I don't know if I remember it. That was like a live action one, right?
Yep.
Let me see. Where's the IMDb for this? Super Mario. 1993?
Yep.
Oh, I don't think I saw this.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you've got some homework.
Is it good?
Well, it's memorable. Let me put it like that. It's definitely memorable. Yeah, I actually saw that I saw that in theaters when it first came out, way back when I was a kid. It was not what I was expecting.
What were you expecting?
I was expecting a Super Mario movie, and that's not really what it is when you get right down to it. I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it. Definitely give that a try sometime.
Fuzzy Cord says it's a wild sci-fi movie, not really a Mario movie. Interesting. And chat's asking if I like Mario or Luigi better. I'm kind of a Yoshi and Donkey Kong fan myself. I didn't really feel any strong loyalty toward Mario or Yoshi, or sorry, Mario or Luigi.
Mm.
More of a Bowsette fan, actually. Yeah, I was joking with Jacob. I was like, is Bowsette in this movie? He was like, holy jail with you. Damn. That was pretty good. Like, the polish of all the graphics and stuff look really good. So, they did a good job making it. The story is very simple. Nothing really stands out as like, oh wow, I can't believe that happened. It's like, yep, that's about what you would expect them to need to do on their quests. Okay.
Have you seen anything else interesting other than the Super Mario movie?
Did I tell you that I watched Captain Marvel? I hadn't seen that one.
How was it?
It's good. It's a very standard, as someone described in chat, like a Marvel superhero punching stuff movie. It does have some good concepts in it, like kind of discovering one's inner power and manipulation of people who have control over you and trying to limit your growth and that kind of thing. I will try not to spoil too much, but I think some people didn't like it, kind of for similar reasons to why they might not have liked Legend of Korra. I don't know if you've heard of the Avatar TV shows, but
I've heard of them, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it addresses a lot of stuff like gaslighting and basically someone who's gone through trauma. And it's not as fun to watch a character that's kind of broken and going through trauma and trying to rediscover themselves. It's an important type of story to tell, but I'm not quite sure why people disliked Captain Marvel as much as they did. Seemed fine to me. Again, not groundbreaking cinema, but I would say I enjoyed it more than Mario. The highest bar.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I also saw Starship Troopers for the first time.
Really? 1997?
Yeah. I had never seen that movie. Can you guess why?
Oh, right.
Family values.
Yeah, not really a cornerstone of the movie's theme.
No.
Well, what did you think of it?
I thought it was really funny.
Yeah,
the satire was really good. It definitely sheds a lot of light on the issues with propaganda and just how being aggressive and not really trying to work on diplomacy or whatever and being very militaristic has a lot of key downsides. And apparently the book of that was more kind of arguing in favor of these concepts of, in order to vote and be a citizen, you should have to serve in the military first, which the movie kind of takes the opposite tack in that sense, which is interesting. But then apparently the author had died before the movie was made, so he couldn't really protest too much about that.
Yeah, that was a oh shit, what's his name? He was actually a famous sci-fi writer, and then suddenly his name escapes me.
Who's the author of Starship Troopers, chat? Would you like to know more? Robert Heinlein.
Thank you, Robert Heinlein. Yeah, he's written a lot of sci-fi stuff, and he's kind of known for being chatty. Right, a lot of his stuff is very much about ideas, about society, politics, culture, etc. And if you read the book, it is radically different than the movie. Right, the book is very much about discourse. Well, I mean, the book is literally just discourse. Most of it is not action or anything substantive happening. It's just the main character kind of introspecting. And you can kind of see him discuss some of the ideas that the author is interested in just through his own internal sort of dialogue. Yeah, the movie was not even originally supposed to be an adaptation of the book. From what I've read, it was just supposed to be like a generic action movie. And then they just got the rights to the book after the fact and just kind of slapped the label on there just to kind of give it a little more pizzazz. Fans of the book were not amused.
This isn't what he meant at all.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, to be fair to Heinlein, I keep wanting to call him Harryhausen. That's a totally different guy. My brain is malfunctioning. That was the stop motion animator. So Heinlein, in Heinlein's book, his idea is not that people should only vote if they've served in the military. His idea is that people have to earn the right to vote by showing that they're willing to sacrifice something for society, to show that they respect their role as a citizen. They respect that their role as a citizen is to propagate society and defend it and be responsible in practicing the duties of a citizen. And the way to do that, basically, his argument was to have them do either military service or some other risky type of public service. You know, even in the book, he makes the case that there are people who are physically incapable of serving in the military, but they can still make a substantive contribution by doing some kind of other work for the government in the public service that entails some degree of risk. And that this serves to weed out people who are not really serious about upholding government and being a responsible citizen. So it was not, you know, basically it was not a militaristic book originally, right? The message is not, you know, that everybody needs to serve in the military and that militarism is the secret sauce to having a robust society. It's more that military service and conflict is an effective means of weeding out people who do not have the willpower or discipline to wield their power as a citizen responsibly. And there's a whole debate about, you know, the efficacy of that argumentation, but the movie does not explore that, you know, at all. It kind of takes a very different tack.
I heard the second and third movie were not nearly as good as the first one.
Oh no, those were like B movies, direct to DVD type stuff.
The first one seemed really polished and there was a lot going on.
Oh yeah, that was a big budget movie. You know, that was very much a summer release. You know, they put a lot of effort into it. Definitely one of my all-time favorite movies.
Yeah, it has so much in common with StarCraft as well. Like, it's basically a Zerg versus Terran.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, if you're a teenage armchair general, then it's especially entertaining. Very much nails that whole perspective very well. Yeah, if you want to see a better adaptation, well, basically it mixes the movie and the book, and it's a little more balanced in doing so. There was actually a cartoon, an animated series called Starship Troopers Roughnecks, if I remember correctly.
Rico's Roughnecks or something?
No, not Rico's. It was just Roughnecks. But it was basically, you know, the same characters, but they redid the universe a little bit. So they actually did have powered armor, which was one of the things that people remembered from the books. Yeah, that was Starship Troopers, the book, was one of the first stories to kind of have powered armor in it. And it's kind of remembered for that. So the cartoon actually had that and incorporated other elements from the book and was a little more faithful than the movie. But they also borrowed stuff from the movie, that being, you know, mostly the action. It was mostly an action story, so they very much focused on the war against the bugs and that kind of stuff. But I thought it was interesting how they made it a little more introspective. You know, they kind of had interesting themes and messages about the nature of war in a children's cartoon, you know, of all things. And they actually handled it relatively maturely, considering the target audience. So I gave them a lot of credit for that. I used to watch that when I was a kid, way back when.
Nice. Oh, and I also saw for the first time ever. Austin Powers. Never seen
Oh,
that
yeah?
movie before. Yeah.
I think I saw the first one, but none of the others.
Yeah. Didn't see it for the same reason that I didn't see Starship Troopers. Booba. And then what else? Oh, I saw Mean Girls for the first time. That one's pretty good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You've been busy.
Yeah. We did a back-to-back movie night with my girlfriend and her Discord community and stuff. We watched Mean Girls and Austin Powers both.
Oh,
and then
cool.
Starship Troopers another time. Whenever I told people that I hadn't seen that movie and I'm like a career StarCraft streamer, they're like, what? How?
Yeah, I can believe that.
Well, if we want to get to some news
yeah.
beyond just movies, I do like talking about movies. I think it makes the segment more down to earth and we're not being super stuffy and intellectual all the time. We can talk about trashy movies too. The golden question of the past 6 years: is Trump actually in trouble this time or not?
Yeah, there was like some recordings that were released,
Yeah.
basically of him basically saying that he had taken classified material and kept it. I think it had to do with, I think that was the one that had to do with war plans.
To invade
Something
Iran.
like that. Yeah. Mind you, not plans to invade Iran, but contingency plans outlining what an invasion might look like. So supposedly those plans were taken and may have been handed over to Saudi Arabia. So that seems pretty damning. But I'm not sufficiently familiar with the relevant laws to make an informed judgment about that. So I can't really I can't tell you whether or not there's going to be a conviction. He's already being investigated for, multiple things, misplacement of classified material among them. So, one of his defenses in the classified material case is that he, as president, had effectively de facto declassified all of the material that he brought with him. Not so much that he had gone through the normal procedure for declassification, but rather that just by dint of being president, that he had just automatically done so by dint of taking them with him, which is a little bit dubious of an argument. But it was meant to kind of explain away the fact that he did have some classified material in his possession after he was not supposed to. But the recording very much puts that into doubt because, in the recording, he kind of explicitly says that I have classified material, which kind of puts a dent in his argument there. So whether or not that has bearing on that particular case or is grounds for a new investigation, we'll see. I would not hold my breath. Executive privilege is pretty expansive in the United States. So I suspect, if nothing else, he can just cite that, and that may well be enough to get him off the hook. Yeah, I know
That would
everybody.
be a norm that's changed, though, right? Because previous presidents haven't done that.
Previous presidents have actually been pretty consistent in citing executive privilege to try to explain away this, that, or the other thing that they want to do, but technically are not supposed to. That goes all the way back to, Nixon and the Watergate scandal. It was supposed to be, he had recordings that he had made that were related to Watergate, and he did not want to release them to the investigators. And Congress basically all but forced him to hand them over, just gave him an ultimatum. And his argument for why he did not have to hand them over, was executive privilege, right? These are my recordings and I don't have to hand them over. It is at my discretion whether or not I do so. And pretty much every president since, and probably many before, have used that executive privilege argument to try to rationalize, what is in effect bad behavior. So yes, there are norms that are used that executive privilege is used to breach. But at this point, using executive privilege to breach norms is itself a de facto norm for the presidency.
It's not the first time this kind of thing has been used as a tactic to defend behavior that people might have said is wrong in some way.
Yeah, and that's just part of a broader trend in American politics that has to do with the expansion of the scope of the executive branch's power. What some people have called Leviathan, right? The executive branch just gets more and more power and becomes less and less accountable to the legislative branch. And, the legislative branch itself has been sort of complicit in that, in so much as they're basically pawning off some of their own responsibilities so that the risk of failing in that responsibility falls on the executive branch instead of them. And there's also just partisanship. If so long as your guys, so long as your party's guys in power in general, that party will, the relevant party, will go relatively easy on that president and doesn't mind just kind of letting him do what he wants without exacting too much oversight over it. So, that's all very unfortunate. It kind of unbalances the checks and balances that are designed into the system and gives the presidency much more discretion than it's supposed to have, which opens the door to, any number of abuses. But yeah, we'll see.
Sounds like a maybe.
Yeah. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm wary about commenting too much on legal stuff. I've tried my hand before, but it's been with pretty mixed results. So I don't want to subject people to it too much. But yeah, that's my understanding. There is reason to believe that this could get him in more trouble, but he's got a lot of tools to work with such that he can deflect that. And keep in mind, as we've said before, you can run for president if you're in jail.
Right, we did talk about that.
Yeah, so even if you do get him, he could still be president. It may not matter.
Would that be a world first? Have we had a president or prime minister in the world who has led a country from jail?
I don't think ever from jail.
Hello, I'm the president of the United States speaking to you from jail.
Yeah, I don't think anything's gone that far anywhere. Maybe there has been, maybe the closest you could come is maybe somebody who you think is the legitimate president, but who was ousted. Kind of like that President Castillo in Peru. He kind of got ousted after he tried to dissolve the Congress down there. And he's kind of been detained since then, pending an investigation. And some people consider him the legitimate president of Peru still. And so you could argue that he's technically leading the country from jail, but he is not de facto in control of the country. So that's kind of an abstract argument. So no, I think the real answer is that there hasn't been anybody who's led a country from jail as of yet.
Eugene versus Debs.
That was different because in that case he was running for president from jail. He was running for president from jail. Eugene Debs was a socialist. He was like the premier socialist in the United States, and he ran for president, I think, in basically during World War I. And there was a number of sedition laws that were put in place during the war that made it basically an arrestable offense to criticize the government or to undermine the war effort. So, of course, Eugene Debs, like a lot of socialists, was extremely critical of World War I. And he was correspondingly arrested. But, technically, he was allowed to continue his presidential campaign, which he did. He didn't do too badly, but, he was nowhere near becoming president. So not technically an example of a president, well, not technically an example of a country being run from jail, but that is an example of somebody running for president from jail. So close, but not quite.
Well, it would definitely make for an interesting presidential debate.
I should say so.
Ah.
I guess they would have to do it remotely.
Mm-hmm. Well, since the person in the jail cell can't leave, the other person could just go and have the debate in jail.
I don't think that they would be willing to do that. I'm a little skeptical.
Our presidential debates are a circus anyway. I think it would be on par.
True. I would concede that point. But I don't think any given presidential candidate would want to be seen in jail, regardless of context. The optics are not great.
Yeah, they have pretty small windows. That's fair. Someone in chat wants to hear from Agent Smith and the actions by Ukraine in Belgorod, which pull Russian forces across a longer line.
Yeah, I don't know how much the Russians are really going to worry about it. I don't know the degree to which they're actually going to redeploy substantive numbers of troops there, because it's not as though the raids are that big. Have you heard about this?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we can get into that then. Let me just still adding stuff here. Okay, Ukraine. Yeah, so do you remember we were talking about those Russian irregular units that were raiding Russian territory from across the Ukrainian border?
Yeah.
So they've been at it again for the past couple weeks, and they've significantly increased the tempo of their operations. So they'll run into specifically Belgorod. I think it's Belgorod, whatever it is, that one oblast right there next to Ukraine. They've been focusing on that. And they haven't really done too much damage. Basically, they'll just run in, mess with border guards. They'll drive as far in as they can get before meeting resistance, and then they'll leave. So it doesn't seem like they're really trying to take territory. It seems more just like raiding for the sake of, well, for one, embarrassing the Russians, but also two, they want to try to inspire or perhaps instigate people into turning on the government. I don't think it's all that likely to work. I think the propaganda side is probably the more impactful of the two objectives. So that's probably more of what they're going for there. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be enough to pull enough troops away from other parts of the front to make a difference to the war effort. And really, I don't even know that Moscow really cares that much that the raiding is even happening, because for them, it's a propaganda opportunity for them as well. They can make the point that these Ukrainians are attacking Mother Russia, doing damage, etc. And I think there have been some civilian deaths, partly from Russian units trying to go after the irregulars, but also partly from some action by the irregulars themselves. So, it's useful from that perspective. And these raids are not really big enough to really take and hold large tracts of territory anyway. The Russians have been able to push them out with relatively minimal effort. So while the scale of the raids is increasing, their impact is not. So I wouldn't read too much into them at this point. If they start doing raids into other parts of Russia, deeper into their territory, and it seems like they're getting some support, or it seems like they're actually, taking control of certain areas and trying to govern them, that would be more substantive. But right now, it's mostly just for show, it seems.
not
there's
about
two
doing
groups.
actual damage. It's about sending a message.
Yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much what it comes down to. Yeah, there's two groups, Liberty of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. And I think it's the Liberty of Russia Legion is sort of a nationalist outfit. And it's got some very, very right-wing figures linked to it. Let's see. The other one, the Russian Volunteer Corps, that's more... Those are basically volunteers that had joined the Ukrainian army to fight against the Russian army. And the Ukrainian government or military has kind of pushed them into this particular group in order to kind of launch raids into Russian territory. And their politics are a little more mundane. Like there doesn't seem to be significant extremist sentiment among their ranks. They're more just generically critical of the Putin government and want, reform. But they lack the far right credentials of the Liberty of Russia Legion, which has somewhat more ambitious objectives for Russia. Not really interested in liberal democracy so much, but they do want Putin out. They don't see him as being sufficiently nationalistic.
Really?
Yeah, not everybody on the far right in Russia is pro-Putin. In general, they tend to like him, but there are some people who are very critical. Besides the fact that the government is very corrupt and is not really making Russia stronger in any substantive degree. There's also the fact that they don't like that there's a lot of illegal immigration is something of an issue for them. Mm-hmm. Basically they want more efforts to try to boost the Russian ethnic population and to try to kind of reverse the decline there.
Where are people migrating from?
A lot of them from Central Asia. So Moscow, well, really just Russia in general, but Moscow in particular gets a lot of migrant workers from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Also some other places, but those two are, particular sources of migrant labor because they're relatively poor and they don't have enough job opportunities, in their own country to kind of get by. There's also a fair amount of Chinese people kind of coming over the border in the Russian Far East. Not necessarily a whole lot, but, if you're a far right xenophobe ethno-nationalist, then any is too much, Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's also some North Koreans who have kind of been coming over. Generally that migration is regulated. It's not like illegal immigration in the case of the Chinese and the North Koreans, but nationalists don't really care much. They see that as, a quote-unquote invasion.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that Vice documentary a long time ago about the North Korean workers in Siberia. They were just doing like pretty basic lumber stuff, but that was a way for them to make more money than they would have in North Korea, and then they get sent back after.
Yeah, that was a good episode. Yeah, it's too bad Vice doesn't do more of that anymore.
I think we were still hanging out in person and stuff back when the guy was going through North Korea and like taking the tours and stuff.
Oh, really?
That was one of the craziest Vice documentaries. Yeah, that was the first time I saw inside North Korea, was a Vice guide thing.
Was that the Dennis Rodman thing?
The guy who was doing the journalism might have done a follow-up with that, but this was pre-Dennis Rodman.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, he was just like going on one of those tours where you have all your minders with you who make sure you don't go in certain areas and you're kind of on a track, and they show you what they want to show you and keep you away from what they don't want you to see, and they're always checking what you're filming.
Yeah, I don't know why people want to go there. Seems like a pretty large risk to take for very little gain.
Yeah, well, if you're a journalist, that's one of the ways that you get visibility and do the reporting that everyone else is afraid to do. I definitely agree, like for your average citizen tourist, that's a very silly place to go with very high risk of getting thrown in jail for an indeterminate amount of time.
Well, other than that, I didn't have too much as far as Ukraine updates. As far as the raids into Russia, it was noted that there were some, allegedly, there were American military vehicles that were used in the raids.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Russian government didn't particularly appreciate that. The US government was kind of ambiguous, about whether or not that had actually happened. Basically, Washington said that it did not support strikes inside of Russia. The actual quote was, "We do not encourage or enable strikes inside of Russia." So they did not confirm or deny that American vehicles had been used.
Mm-hmm.
Some people were saying that it might have been staged, which is possible, but I don't really think it's that unreasonable to think that raiders equipped by the Ukrainian military might have gotten some American equipment and might have been using it to strike into Russia itself. So it's possible. I don't think it matters that much one way or the other, but some people were trying to make a big deal out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the only other thing I really had to report on Ukraine was the strikes. There was more. Well, basically, Ukraine had a national holiday recently. I think it was last week. And the day of the holiday, Russia launched a volley of cruise missiles and loitering munitions at a range of targets in Ukraine, specifically targeting Kiev, as I recall. And after that, there were several days of strikes by the Russians, basically following up.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ukraine did retaliate to some degree. Yeah, there was maybe around like a dozen or so drones, I think suicide drones, basically, loitering munitions, that were launched from Ukraine targeting Moscow. And supposedly most of them were shot down, possibly all of them, but there was some damage done. There were some residential buildings that were hit by debris and wreckage and whatnot. So there was some minor damage and fires. Was a little surprising to see drones make it that far into Russia. You'd think the air defenses would be better, but apparently there's some holes in Russia's air defense network. So it wasn't much. It wasn't nearly as strong an attempt as, say, the Russians have been trying to make in Ukraine recently. But it did kind of send a message that Russia's not vulnerable. And I think somebody online did note that some of the areas that they were targeting were actually some of the wealthier residential areas where Russian elites were living.
Mm-hmm.
So more about propaganda, I guess, than anything. And maybe trying to scare some Russian elites a little bit to make sure they don't feel immune to all of the fighting going on. Yeah, one of the interesting bits of fallout from that was that I think two governments, I think it was the British government and the French government, I want to say, came out after the fact and said that they had no problem with Ukraine striking targets in Russia, which is a reversal. They had been pretty cagey about whether or not they wanted Ukraine to be doing that, because they were afraid of a potential for escalation. But it seems, in light of the recent airstrikes by Russia and Ukraine, there's been some change in opinion in that regard. So at least in two major backers of Ukraine, they don't take issue with Ukraine striking targets in Russia now. So you could see a lot more of that. It'll be especially interesting to see if maybe there is a greater willingness to give Ukraine long-range missiles, because right now we've been pretty cagey about giving them anything with a range longer than 100 kilometers. We've been giving them the HIMARS. More recently they got the Storm Shadow cruise missile from the UK. But the range in most of those is relatively limited. And in the case of Storm Shadow, the British supposedly extracted a promise from Ukraine that they wouldn't use them to strike targets deep inside Russia. But, if they don't mind if targets are struck inside Russia, they may well start equipping them with weapons, especially the ATACMS. God, it's an acronym. I don't even remember what it's supposed to. Some Army Tactical something cruise missile. But basically, It's a long-range cruise missile, and the Ukrainians have been asking for it basically since the start of the war. And the U.S. has been very, very reluctant to give them any because it doesn't want to escalate things by giving them greater capability to hit Russia. But since sentiment seems to be changing on that, it's possible that we may start equipping them and that they may actually start attacking Russia directly. So it'll be interesting to see what Russia does if that is in fact the case. You know, the Russian retaliation to the raids into Belgorod have not exactly been significant, you know, I would argue. So it may well be the case that there won't be significant escalation if Ukraine does start going after targets in Russia substantively. But that's a big open question, and of course, there's a lot of risk there if they're wrong. Mm-hmm. So stay tuned. Something to keep our eye on.
Yeah, just from like a video gamer standpoint, it makes the situation a lot more complicated if you have to worry about defending yourself and also trying to focus on attacking at the same time. Mm-hmm. A lot more fronts to consider in that kind of thing than if you just expect them to only play defensively. Then you can basically cut corners in your own defense because you make the assumption that they're not going to contest you.
Yeah, but I wouldn't expect any dramatic changes there. Mm-hmm. For the most part, it seems like Russia is just trying to hunker down in Donbass and just trying to hold whatever they can while launching limited attacks in different parts of the front in efforts to make incremental gains. You know, they have taken some territory, but it's just very small at the moment. Mm-hmm. We'll see what the Ukrainians do if and when they do launch some kind of major counteroffensive, although that's probably a long ways off yet. Mostly it's just a war of attrition at this point. The Russians want to wait out the West, and the Ukrainians want to wait out Russia. Mm-hmm. So it's going to come down to who can and is willing to last longer. Mm-hmm. You know, actual territorial changes in that sense don't matter that much.
Yeah. You could lose a base and retake the base later if you can capture it and maintain your overall momentum.
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's probably going to drag out a while. Well, is there anything else we wanted to get to?
There was a Chinese warship that almost hit a U.S. battlecruiser, or battleship, something.
I think it was a destroyer.
Oh yeah, wouldn't the Chinese warship get destroyed if you hit a destroyer? That's what they do.
I mean, both of them would get damaged. You know, they're not designed to ram other ships. Mm-hmm. You know, your CEO will be very upset with you if you wreck your ship like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think you know, basically it's just partly intimidation. Well, mostly it's just about intimidation and being annoying, because those waters are disputed. But even if they're disputed, the Chinese don't want to start a war over it. You know, at least not right now. Mm-hmm. So what do you do if you think somebody is intruding into your territory, but you don't want to fire any shots in anger over it? Well, you can just be a dick, basically, and you know what is it? Brake check. You know, like the road equivalent would be brake checking, mm-hmm. right? Which is, you know, rude behavior. So this is the naval equivalent of that. You know, just sailing directly in front of a ship and making them try to change course is a way of sending a message that you're upset that they're there, but you're not going to try to kill them. There was a similar incident recently involving a Chinese aircraft and an American aircraft where the Chinese, I think it was a fighter, swung in front of the American aircraft dangerously close, you know, so the American government said. So, you know, this is just sort of antagonizing behavior. It's not really meant to be violent, but it is meant to kind of signal displeasure at the presence of the aircraft in question. And it's not unusual. It happens. It's been happening with increasing frequency over the past 10 years, over the past 5 years in particular.
So there wasn't really actual aggression. It was just driving aggressively in their area.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, the American ship was sailing through the Taiwan Strait, which of course is it's a very sensitive area for the Chinese government. So, they generally signal displeasure in one way or the other when that happens. So, this time they decided to go with brake checking. So long as they're not shooting, I don't really care too much.
Just posturing, really.
Yeah. This is the diplomatic equivalent of shit posting, It's meant to antagonize, but not much else besides. So you can kind of safely ignore it for the most part. They know we're not going to stop because of this. And we know that they don't really want to escalate that much. So it's mostly just for show. Trying to show the people back home in the domestic political arena that the government is doing something. It's not starting a war over it, but it is making some kind of effort.
Performance art.
Yeah, as with much of politics and diplomacy. Excuse me. Well, my house sitting has upset my schedule.
It's okay, I'm sleepy too. World discussion has been renamed into Nap Time with Agent Smith.
There you go. That's the spirit.
Yeah.
Well, I did have other China stuff if we want to do that, but I don't know if we have other questions first.
Yeah, we can do that while we're there and tackling that. I think Fuzzy Cord said he's down to take questions.
Oh, thank you, Fuzzy Cord. Always appreciate it. Let's see. Let me find out what I did with the... Oh, there it is. Yeah, so recently, the news as far as China, and specifically Sino-American competition, has centered around two major events. And, major in the context of Sino-American competition, So, generally what passes for major in the context of Sino-American competition is relatively boring, since the competition is relatively bland at this point. It's kind of what you want. If it were more exciting, there would be people dying, so that's not great. So I'll take bland, but it can be hard to get people interested in it, talking about some of the bureaucratic maneuvering that goes on, which really defines the competition at this juncture. So the two major events recently were the G7 meeting and the IPEF meeting, right? So these were two big conferences that largely focused on China and on steps that they could take in order to try to mitigate the challenge and threat posed by the Chinese government. So let's see, as far as the IPEF agreement, IPEF is Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. That was an initiative started up by the Biden administration to try to mitigate China's economic influence in the Indo-Pacific region. We've been talking about China and the United States since we started this segment. And one of the original criticisms I made, way back in the day, and I've made consistently since, is that U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China has focused disproportionately on the military and to a lesser degree on the political, but really has not significantly focused on the economic side of it. The principal form of leverage that China has in competition with the United States for influence in the world is economic influence. Just by dint of the size of its economy, the sheer amount of exports, imports, etc., China can bring a lot to the table. And the United States, by not really addressing that in any significant way, has really failed to substantively curb Chinese influence. And in that sense, the Sino-American competition, such as it is, has been a fairly one-sided affair over time. Most of what the United States government has done in response to the rise of China has been relatively minor hedging strategies. A diplomatic agreement here, a basing agreement there, maybe some kind of memorandum amongst like-minded countries, but nothing to really substantively, say, open up U.S. markets such that there would be greater economic dependency on the United States relative to dependency on China. That's the kind of concrete move that you would need to do in order to really mitigate Chinese economic influence. That has not been in the cards. There was an attempt to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big Pacific Free Trade deal, but then the Trump administration pretty well backed out of that, kind of at the goal line. When they were trying to finalize the treaty, the Trump administration backed out of it. Now, the participating countries involved in the negotiation of that treaty did actually go forward with the agreement, albeit without the United States. But the United States was really one of the cornerstones of the agreement. Japan and some of the other big economies can only do so much as counterweights to China. You really need something of equivalent size to China to really act as that counterweight. And so the United States kind of shot itself in its own foot there by doing that. I know the agreement was unpopular amongst many quarters in the United States, but that really was like the biggest single thing the U.S. could have done in order to do that, in order to curb economic influence by China. So the Biden administration recognized that, but it also recognized that resurrecting the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal was not really politically viable. Too many people were too critical of it. So as a kind of halfway measure to try to do something substantive about China's economic influence without signing any new controversial free trade deals, was to create what they called the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. And basically, it's just a talking shop amongst like-minded countries concerned about China's rise, in which they can discuss different ways to integrate their economies more in order to try to mitigate China's economic influence. But one of the main things that you can do in any kind of free trade deal is to open up market access. But market access is just virtually completely off the table here in IPEF, as well as, in other similar initiatives. IPEF is the biggest one, but just in general, you can see that all of the economic initiatives the United States launches do not involve market access. And as such, there's very limited enthusiasm in the region as a result, because market access is what they really want. That would be the main way that their industries could grow and diversify their trade away from China. Everything else is just peanuts, basically, in comparison. There are things you can do that don't involve market access to improve interconnectivity and reduce dependence on China, but the effects are going to be marginal. It's not going to be that much. So I don't think anybody really had high hopes for IPEF. There were definitely countries that were interested in participating in the dialogue, but nobody expected much to come out of it. And up until a couple of weeks ago, nothing had come out of it. It was still just in the dialogue phase, where countries are kind of feeling each other out and trying to get an understanding of what was possible and what kinds of initiatives they should be pursuing, and basically just what's doable in general. So a couple of weeks ago, we finally got some fruit, right? They finally came to an agreement, what they call the IPEF supply chain agreement. And it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's just kind of an agreement that in principle involves all of the countries involved trying to cooperate to diversify their supply chains and also make their supply chains more robust. And of course, the idea there is that they want to get their supply chains to a point where if the Chinese government tries to cut them off from the supply of some strategic good or some otherwise important key good in the supply chain of a major producer in their country, then by dint of having participated in this agreement, the effects will be mitigated. That's basically the principle. Whether or not it's actually going to succeed is kind of debatable. There's a lot of things you would have to do to actually sort of diversify supply chains away from China. You would have to dig pretty deep to do that, because China produces a lot of stuff and is present in a variety of supply chains for a variety of industries. And creating alternatives is not easy. I mean, China has real comparative advantages in a lot of that. So if you want to try to make it economically viable to pick a different producer, you've got to provide subsidies, you've got to build up the human capital necessary. If you're trying to build up alternatives in a country that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure or has other economic disadvantages, you have to overcome all of that in addition to providing subsidies and other things in order to get a local producer on a competitive par with pre-existing Chinese competitors. So, it's really not very easy. And the steps they've taken as part of the IPEF supply chain agreement are not really anywhere near that league. But something is better than nothing. So, they are at least trying, and they do have at least something to show for it, even if it isn't much. Basically, the IPEF supply chain agreement consists of three things. The IPEF Supply Chain Council, the IPEF Supply Chain Crisis Response Network, and the IPEF Labor Rights Advisory Board. So the council is basically just responsible for overseeing the development of what are called action plans that are supposed to build resilience and competitiveness in critical sectors. So you'll note that this is not very tangible, right? You would think that an agreement to diversify supply chains would have some specific plans in mind to implement. But instead here, the council is not itself a plan to diversify supply chains. Rather, the purpose of the council is itself to come up with plans. And this is something that you see pretty commonly in diplomacy, where there's not a lot of consensus on a path forward. If different countries can't agree on a specific course of action, then often they can just create sort of filler institutions that are designed to kind of come up with ideas later. They're effectively kicking the can down the road. So they all agree that something should be done, but they don't quite know what. And so they're going to create a committee that's responsible for kind of trying to tease out what exactly that could be. So again, it's better than nothing, but in the short term, at least, it's not really that impressive. And it could very easily be the case that this committee is largely symbolic and does not actually produce any results. The Supply Chain Crisis Response Network is a little more interesting. So this basically creates communication channels by which any country that is coming under basically attack by China, economic pressure from China, can have a way to communicate with like-minded countries and coordinate a kind of response in order to alleviate that pressure. So it's just a communications channel for the moment, but this has the potential to kind of spill out into something bigger. If they do, say, create a kind of strategic reserve of critical resources of one kind or another that could be tapped in case of emergency, in case of, say, China applying economic pressure, that could be the next step here, where that common strategic pool is there and can be used by any given partner country in that event. So that was interesting, but for now, still not much. And then the Labor Rights Advisory Board, basically that's just going to be a symbolic board where countries can kind of criticize each other over labor rights practices. And, that's kind of been a common thing over the past 10, 20 years, where free trade deals have increasingly tried to focus on treatment of labor. Especially in developed countries, there's a sense that one of the reasons that foreign companies are more competitive and able to win market share in developed markets is because labor is cheaper, specifically because labor does not have as many rights and is specifically abused because of it. So there's been more and more pressure to try to involve fair labor practices, clauses of one kind or another in free trade deals, in which partner countries are obligated to some degree to try to treat labor to some minimum standard, and also to have mechanisms by which countries, as well as maybe other actors, can kind of pressure partner countries if cases are found where they are abusing labor. Now, if you've been following free trade over the past 20 years, then you also know that some of these clauses don't really have a lot of teeth, and that they don't really amount to much in practice, which in effect makes them basically symbolic gestures that are meant to kind of placate people concerned about abuses of labor, but also doing so without actually substantively taking action, and thereby probably getting more buy-in from partner countries that are not really interested in having their what they would perceive as their sovereignty violated by another country, trying to force them to change how they deal with labor issues. So that's a kind of a convenient sidestep. So this IPEF Labor Rights Advisory Board, basically, I strongly suspect will end up being something very similar. From a legal perspective, it is nice to have a forum where labor rights abuses can be cataloged. That does help build something of a legal case there. And that is helpful to a degree for labor activists in various countries. But at the same time, as far as being a mechanism in and of itself that could pressure countries to change, it's not going to do that. So I suspect this particular item is mostly a political item that the Biden administration added to try to deflect pressure from pro-labor political forces in the United States. So the most interesting item of the three is the supply chain network response, or rather the supply chain crisis response network. I think that's the most interesting, but perhaps the most important one is the Supply Chain Council, since that has the potential to act as a kind of focal point, an institutional focal point by which the relevant actors can more readily cooperate on building new institutions that can kind of flesh out the overarching supply chain agreement. Mm-hmm. But that all remains to be seen. That just depends on how much partner countries actually want to invest in it, how much they really trust the United States and other partner countries to cooperate, as well as how much they're willing to kind of trade away some sovereignty in exchange for greater solidarity. So all of that is kind of open-ended right now, but it is at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a venue for discussion on, you're talking about all of their operations being more versatile, robust to change, and then also being more considerate of the people who are the moving parts of all of these operations.
Mm. As part of that announcement in which they discussed the IPEF supply chain agreement, they also announced a bunch of peripheral initiatives that are not a part of the agreement, but basically consist of the United States taking unilateral initiatives to try to improve connectivity and interaction between partner countries' economies. And it's nothing particularly sexy. A lot of it is just procedural stuff, trying to make the actual minutia of going through customs and getting cleared and all that a little more efficient, a little faster. There's some trade mission type stuff where, basically government officials and bureaucrats will try to get certain economic actors, private companies, entrepreneurs, et cetera, to come and visit another country and try to find business opportunities that maybe they would not otherwise have been aware of. There's also a student exchange program they're going to set up, just to make that a little easier. So, just a lot of little things here and there. Nothing too substantive. The supply chain agreement is definitely like the main item. But it is worth noting here that the United States is at least being proactive now. Over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of talk about trying to tackle China and the rise of Chinese influence. But the United States really had not been doing much until maybe like midway through the Trump administration. And even then, the actions taken had not really been that substantive. I would argue actions taken are not really all that substantive now. But at least they are applying a lot more pressure on a much wider range of issues. Before it was like one big thing, like tariffs. We're going to raise tariffs and we're going to negotiate with the Chinese and that'll be our leverage. But then nothing ever came of that. And, other than that, there just really had not been much. So now
something came of that. The chair company that made the gaming chair that I'm sitting on now went out of business because they got metal from China and they got tariffed.
They couldn't source it from somebody else?
Not for the same price. Nope.
I guess that's a fair point.
F's in the chat for OPC. We still benefit from your craftsmanship today.
How weird.
Yeah.
They must have had some pretty narrow profit margins if that was enough to sink them.
Oh, the most narrow. Yeah.
But basically, just in general, there's been a lack of real planning that has gone into America's China foreign policy. There just hasn't been a lot going into that. So, I would argue that the recent actions in IPEF have not really been much either, but they are at least putting more thought into it. Just the range of different initiatives itself illustrates that they're thinking about it more. So I give credit for that at least. Still like to see more, but beggars can't be choosers. So that was the IPEF agreement. The other big thing, let's see, let me move this down. So the other big thing was the G7. And basically, this is another example of something, an agreement that doesn't amount to that much in and of itself, but does at least represent progress. There is more and more momentum to the programs and planning that the United States puts into its China foreign policy. And so this is another example of that. So during the G7 meeting, there was a lot of talk about de-risking versus decoupling. Excuse me. So the United States wants to do decoupling. It basically it does not want to fully decouple from China as far as trade. Contrary to what some people say, it really is more of a kind of pick and choose decoupling. They want certain strategic sectors to be diversified fully away from China, but beyond that, they are okay with a certain baseline level of trade with China. But even that is too much for some countries, especially in Europe. They talk more about de-risking, so not so much separating from China, but more about managing the risk that is posed by being economically dependent on China in certain areas. So to a degree, the difference between de-risking and decoupling is kind of academic. But for Europe, it is an important distinction because they feel that decoupling is just too confrontational. In a sense, it's about optics, almost basically presentation. The European message is that they do want to trade with China and see it as a partner country, but that they want to protect themselves from any potential pressure that may come from without, not only from China, but also potentially elsewhere. The United States message, in contrast, is that we're worried about China and we want to mitigate the risk that China poses to us, which is a much more focused, forceful message than what the Europeans are putting out. So the reason the Europeans are concerned is that their economic growth has not been quite as strong, and they have a lot of, there's a number of political issues within Europe that could potentially be solved with more economic growth, and that will be exacerbated by less economic growth. So trade with China, in so much as it's an important cornerstone of the European economy, is a sensitive issue for them. They don't want to piss off the Chinese too much, even if they do recognize the strategic imperative of mitigating the risk posed by economic dependency. So they've been much slower to move on. Again, they've been moving much slower against China than the United States has as a result. And also the result has been discussions like the one that was at the G7 about, de-risking and decoupling. So there was a lot of hemming and hawing, and eventually the agreement that they reached was on the creation of what they called a coordination platform. And this is kind of similar to the committee that was negotiated in IPEF. It's kind of vague on how it's going to work, but basically it's just going to be a forum, a standing forum, basically, in which they will be able to coordinate with each other, communicate, negotiate, etc., about common responses to pressure from China, or potentially even just possible pressure from China.
For a quick refresher, what are the 7 countries of the G7?
Let's see. The United States, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and I think Italy.
Thank you.
Yeah, basically it's just the largest economies. For a while, they actually went out of their way to include Russia, and it became the G8, but then, stuff happened. And Russia has basically been expelled. So now it's back to being the G7 again. Yeah, there were a couple other agreements on supply chains. They wanted to try to coordinate more on diversifying supply chains regarding minerals and semiconductors away from China, no surprise. And they also wanted to beef up digital infrastructure to make it more robust in the face of hacking and other forms of espionage. But that's all stuff that they're kind of already doing. So, that wasn't really as interesting to me. The coordination platform was much more interesting. You can kind of see between the IPEF committee and the coordination platform that they're trying to create standing institutions that can kind of act as fulcrums of anti-China mitigation. Oh, also they talked about export controls, but that's no surprise. The United States has been pushing harder and harder over the past couple of years to try to get a broader range of higher technology items restricted as far as sale to China. There's been some success in that regard over the past year, especially after October, when the United States announced much broader export restrictions, specifically with regard to semiconductors and AI chips. But they've been trying since then to try to get other countries to adapt to those same export restrictions. So I think the Netherlands, Japan, those are the two main ones. The Netherlands and Japan both have adopted those export restrictions in large part. But there's also a desire to try to get third-party countries that are not necessarily that involved in semiconductor production to also adapt those kinds of restrictions in order to prevent them from acting as, basically re-export nodes. So, baby steps between IPEF and G7 here. Again, these are not like huge improvements, but they do illustrate that the United States is being proactive and is actively building new institutions to try to deal with this issue. And in so much as that's the case, it's progress. Now, China actually did retaliate to the agreements made at the G7 meeting. They actually did come out and basically ban Micron from the Chinese market. Micron is a semiconductor manufacturer. I think they do memory chips mostly. But the Chinese government came out and announced somewhat abruptly that they had failed a security check and that they could no longer operate in China. It was an interesting move. I think the argument at the time was that China was trying to split basically allied countries because Japan and South Korea were not affected by this. And so it's entirely possible that Japanese and South Korean semiconductor manufacturers could actually eat up that market share that is going to be vacated by Micron. And the US government, for its part, has already come out and asked the Japanese and South Korean governments not to allow that to happen, basically to show solidarity and to ensure that their own manufacturers do not take advantage of that gap in the Chinese market. I don't know if it's going to work. There's not really any mechanism in place to kind of police that. There's no treaty obligation for them to do that, et cetera. Again, like I was saying, the institutions by which allied countries coordinate against economic pressure like this are pretty nascent. That's part of what the US is trying to build with these, like the IPEF Council and the coordination framework, from the G7. That's the beginning of that process. But because that's not a mature process, the United States is probably going to find it difficult to coordinate as far as common responses to pressure campaigns like this from Beijing. So, ideally, Tokyo and Seoul will show solidarity, and there will be a common message sent to Beijing that, these kinds of campaigns, this kind of pressure will not be tolerated. But it's just as likely at this point that, they'll take this as an opportunity to try to improve market share, improve revenue, and improve growth and performance in their own economies, which in Japan's case in particular has been stagnating for several decades. So we'll see. I don't think the memory chips in question that Micron produces for China are really high tech. So this is not stuff that's going to make or break the Chinese economy or, that's going to allow them to build like bigger and better weapons or anything. So strategically speaking, it's kind of a non-issue. And I suspect that's going to be what Tokyo and Seoul kind of home in on. If this were more advanced technology, they would probably be more willing, I think, to show solidarity. But since this is more of just regular consumer item, they may not care as much. So they could move forward. So if that's the case, it'll be interesting to see how Washington responds to that. That's the kind of difficult diplomatic position that requires very deft diplomacy. And yeah, the United States has not been known for deft diplomacy in a very long time, so that could be a problem. But we'll see. I'm hoping they don't put too much pressure on South Korea and Japan on that count, because that would put them in a difficult position as well politically within their own domestic politics. I think it would be much better to pick to take a milder approach, carrots and sticks, kind of give them incentives while also making it clear that there could be consequences in the medium to long term, nothing short term, but, later on we may retaliate in kind to some degree. I think that would be a smarter approach, but we'll see. It's an interesting challenge. It's very much the kind of thing that people concerned about Chinese influence are worried about. So this is kind of a test case, a litmus test, if you will. Mm. I would point out, too, that the Micron ban is one of the first instances of China directly retaliating to an agreement, like the one made at the G7. The United States has been trying to coordinate a common front against China amongst its allies for some years now. But even when the United States, took the initiative and applied export restrictions or made anti-China agreements or what have you, China never really did that much. And I think most that they have done up until now has been to pass a new law that allows them to sanction companies that participate in basically pressure campaigns targeting China. But they hadn't actually used that yet. Technically, they still haven't used it, but that was the most that they'd done. So it's interesting to note that this is one of the first times that they've explicitly applied economic pressure in response to what they perceive to be an anti-China agreement. Notable in that sense. So there is some room for optimism. The Japanese government did institute some new export controls after China banned Micron. Specifically, chip making equipment as well as a number of other items are now going to be restricted. I don't know if they were planning to do that already or if they went out of their way to do that just to kind of show solidarity with the United States. I would point out that it's not necessarily the case that the export restrictions are going to apply to the kinds of chips that Micron was making, so it may be more symbolic than substantive, but it does show that Tokyo at least does care about the optics of solidarity. And the current government in South Korea is fairly pro-American. They've been pretty skeptical about China from the start, and so they may be relatively more inclined to show solidarity than South Korea might otherwise. Certainly, if the previous government were still in power, they probably would not have cared that much. So some good signs in that sense.
I like causes for optimism. I think the world could use more of it. One thing that's unfortunate consequence of today, and this is my fault, if you ever mention either Trump or Biden, there will be people in the chat who can't help themselves and just go completely off the rails and stick on those names and those topics for hours to come. So chat, as a reminder, you can think about not just what you're saying, but how you say it. And also, be aware that many people are actively being radicalized and pitted against each other because it benefits a lot of news media companies. It benefits political parties to demonize one another. And you might feel very justified in your position, and more power to you. That's very fun, but at least try to be self-aware if you're being very venomous to other people. You can be correct and also tactful, but it does take a little bit of effort to do so. This is your reminder before I turn the chat into emote-only mode.
Yeah, I think as far as China policy goes, these are some of the biggest items this year. Mm-hmm. It's not as important as the October export restrictions announced last year, but this will rank up there. I'm still waiting to see the Biden administration go for that one treaty. I forget what it was called, but it's a treaty that normally involves regulation of equipment and material that is used to make nuclear materials. not necessarily just for nuclear weapons, but just sort of nuclear stuff in general. It was recognized fairly early on that there was a need to have a common policy as far as restricting the flow of the materials that would be necessary to construct nuclear materials, be it for energy or weaponry. And so a treaty was signed in order to kind of regulate that. But it's also been used to regulate the export of military equipment and technology generally, including things like missile technology, specifically ballistic missile technology. And the Biden administration had been interested in trying to expand the scope of that agreement to encompass things like advanced AI chips, advanced semiconductors generally, and other forms of sensitive technology relevant to Sino-American competition. So that's kind of more what I'm watching for this year. I think that would probably be the single biggest thing to happen as far as China policy in the United States, if they can do that. Was it the Bessemer Agreement? Yeah, I forget the technical name of it, but regardless, that's kind of what I'm watching for more than anything. But I thought it was worth mentioning IPEF and G7, since that kind of shows you the trajectory that the United States and China are on right now. We doing okay on time?
Yeah. Got a good hour to go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we started an hour later than
Oh, that's
normal.
right.
My stream started late, and I wanted to get in a couple Dota games. Still very much enjoying that video game.
Yeah, I've been trying to stay away from MOBAs.
Yeah.
But I did give in last night. Played for the first time in like 6 months.
Heroes of the Storm?
Yeah.
Nice.
That's the weak sister on the market, unfortunately.
Hey, my brother really likes that game, and I have quite a few viewers who do. It does certain things that other MOBAs don't really well, so it absolutely has a target audience. I feel like it was a really near miss to it taking off more so than it did, because it brings a lot to the table that League of Legends and Dota do not. It's not really for me in terms of the way that the gameplay works and stuff. I really like Dota a lot. I think that's absolutely my MOBA. But I know that Dota has a lot of shortcomings that Heroes of the Storm does much better at. Kind of depends on which poison you prefer.
Yeah. Well, not being able to communicate with the other team is probably a plus.
Yeah, a lot of people who play Dota actually just turn on the setting where it mutes everyone anyway, so it kind of gives you the same end result.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Let's see, you got options.
Yeah, I talked with my chat about that recently, and how for anyone who's like a medium level skill player or a low level skill player, the advice that you're going to get from your teammates is of such poor quality that muting everyone isn't even really a nerf to your ability to play the game anyway. Because you'll really often get someone who has super strong opinions that are extremely incorrect, but they speak them very loudly and with a lot of gusto. So you feel like, oh, we need to follow the leader and do what this person is saying, but it's really just bad advice. I had a game on Saturday where one of my allies was just super resigned to defeat. They were like, there's nothing we can do. And anyone else who I would talk to about Dota would say that we had the very best late game hero on our team, and they were able to just passively farm more gold over time. So we were getting further and further ahead from where I was standing. Like, it seemed like we were in an amazing spot, but this person just simply thought we were dead. And by virtue of them yelling in the microphone so many times, we couldn't even focus on a plan anymore. I feel like that's society in a nutshell in some cases.
Yeah, there are some real catastrophizers out there.
Yeah.
And not much you can do about them, especially in the context of a MOBA.
Yeah. I think one challenge that I've tried to give to people is whenever you're in a difficult situation, just try to focus on an objective. It might not be the best plan, but a weak plan or a bad plan is better than no plan. So you might as well try something even if you're behind. It's kind of like whenever you're staring at a a math test and you really didn't study for it, you might as well try something. Just go at it with some set of numbers, and maybe the teacher's going to be nice and say that they could tell that you were kind of working toward the right answer, and you get partial credit, maybe 2/3 credit, even though you felt like you were totally lost. That's pretty big. You can approach MOBAs and life in the same way. Maybe you don't fully understand something, but you can give it your best. Heart of a champion.
Yeah. You know, you've got to have focus, drive, and discipline. And if you can, you know, just have that, then even if you're struggling, you know, you'll at least still make progress in the right direction. You know, if you spend all your time catastrophizing and you're just treading water, you know, that's kind of self-indulgent, really.
Some people do feel a sort of, I don't know, savior complex when it comes to that, where they feel like they're the prophet who lets everyone know that they're doomed. And that, I think, gets people going in some capacity. It's exciting to let the world know that they're all wrong about something.
Yeah, what was it? There was an Onion article. An Onion, you know The Onion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was replaced by mainstream news fairly recently.
Yeah, really. Yeah, there was what it had to do with, I think it was John Lennon, because apparently he used to like beat his girlfriends or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Onion headline was, "Man gets cheap thrill out of informing people about John Lennon's abuse of his girlfriends," something like that. Yeah, there's people like that, just like needling people.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily to be mean to them specifically, but just kind of undermining, you know, something they like or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Being the bearer of bad news, you might say,
yeah,
is what excites them.
Yeah. Super exciting. You're all being lied to about everything. Oh no.
Yeah, and of course they have no real solutions to any of that.
Correct.
It's more about the attention than it is the progress.
Absolutely. Attention is tasty. See social media.
Oh, God.
We were talking before we started world discussion about if you were to put an age limit or restriction on social media where kids have to be a certain age before they can use social media, what age would that be? And it's obviously going to depend on the platform and the parenting style and that kind of thing, like whether you're a more permissive parent or a more strict parent. Because a lot of these things like smartphone usage and stuff, it wasn't even an option on the table for us old folks. We had dumb phones. I remember having those like hardcore Nokia battle phones that you could use as a projectile weapon that were really sturdy and you couldn't break them even if it fell off a 3rd-story building. Now we have very fancy phones with fancy cameras and so on. Bit of a different meta for information consumption.
Yeah, it's had a dramatic impact. And it's definitely supercharged some, what's the word? Personality types, I guess. You know, there's very particular personality types that have been amplified disproportionately by social media. You know, pretty much any new technology will do that because there's generally certain types of people that will be most attracted to it and they're going to use it disproportionately. So in so much as those technologies amplify their voices, you can see superficial shifts in society that result. You know, just by dint of changing who you hear from and how loud they are. And social media is definitely, you know, a great example of that. Maybe giving the megaphone to the mentally ill people was not a great idea.
Or just the people who are very quick to speak and slow to think. Because social media definitely rewards people who are willing to say really saucy stuff as opposed to stuff that's high quality information. And the vast majority of people aren't really trained with an attitude of skepticism. That was one of the things that I was honestly a little bit alarmed by. Was we learned about skepticism, I think, in the 2nd tier of cognitive science courses. And it was a whole class on skepticism and about how information can be served to people that's not actually accurate, but that we have a bias of credulity that makes us want to believe what people are saying. And I was like, how in the fuck did we not get taught this in middle school or high school? Because adults are browsing information at all ages, and this is a very specific kind of route that I'm taking in school. And it's fairly deep in the educational track to even get to this class. So people are not really armed with an understanding of skepticism at all.
Mm. Yeah, it's an important skill. And it's deceptively difficult to learn, because biases can be deeply ingrained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, be skeptical of us too in World Discussion with Agent Smith. If we mess stuff up, that's on us, but we're just trying our best. So statistically speaking, if we talk for 3 hours, we're probably going to make more than 3 errors, even if we have the best of intentions.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's probably a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. I do enjoy the feedback we get. Certainly all of the arguments are entertaining, if nothing else.
Well, you have a saucy one to read later.
Oh, boy.
Enjoy.
Will do.
Thanks, Chad, for keeping it lively, even if it's not always as respectful as I might prefer. It's really funny how debates like that are very much a snowball effect, where if you have someone getting other people riled up, then they might not have started riled up, but then they get pulled onto that level. It just kind of keeps going from there.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows when it ends?
Oh, God. Yeah, I've had family like that. Yeah, once you get them started, then they don't stop.
Do you
they
have
just
any...
kind of work themselves up.
This is also a question for chat and YouTube comments. Do you have any family members who are fight starters, where they really love when the family argues and they will actively seek out those situations? I totally do. Hand raised. Because for some people it's entertaining. If they feel like they don't really care if they win or not, they just like to see people getting heated and they thrive in that environment, then absolutely. If they get grandma and grandpa arguing with the aunts and uncles.
Well, see, for me and the people I've known, it's not about liking getting people riled up. It's about themselves feeling slighted or insulted when that wasn't what anybody meant to do.
Oh.
So then they'll feel insulted and they'll get angry, and then they'll just get angry and angrier as they start remembering other cases that they choose to interpret as being insulting.
Mm-hmm.
And that just spirals out from there, and it turns into like a raging argument just from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen some in the family suggest that maybe that's bipolar behavior. But of course, if you suggest somebody get checked for bipolar, then that just gets them angry too.
That's not even what bipolar is. Bipolar is when you have major swings from mania to depression, and you can have those at different extents. But that's not the same as being happy and sad sometimes. Those are very different things. Bipolar gets thrown around a lot as a reason for people to be positive or negative about certain things at different times, but it's used very loosely. Remember, you should not get diagnosed for a mental illness by people at the dinner table. You should go to a professional. Also, you should not get diagnosed by random people on the internet who don't have credentials. I had one person in a really, really big direct message, I might have mentioned this to you in the past, diagnosed me with narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder in the same big message.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's amazing that they had that much time in their day to...
How nice of them to share their expertise.
Yeah. Do you want to know how they came to this conclusion?
I would love to know.
They were listening to a broadcast of some other Twitch streamers who were all talking about these conditions and then theory crafting who they thought was more like these diagnoses. And they were like, oh, well, I need to make sure Neuro knows that he's got these ones.
Well, how helpful.
Yeah. think Fuzzy Cord may have gotten a couple questions.
Oh. Okay. I did send you a picture. Well, a map, technically. So we might talk about that later if you have the time. Let's see.
Oh, a map. I love maps.
Oh, Ken Paxton. That's right. What's your take on Ken Paxton's impeachment?
Who's that?
Ken Paxton is the Attorney General of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he's been in trouble a lot forever, basically since he's been in office. He's always getting in trouble for one thing or another. So, I mean, the fact that he's getting impeached is not surprising. You know, that's probably been a long time coming. You can kind of tell that he's been engaged in some shady dealings by the fact that the GOP here is actively participating and supporting his impeachment. You know, if it were really politically motivated, then the Democrats would not have their support. But as is, there's plenty of Republicans who are pretty tired of his shit, too. So, yeah, good riddance to bad rubbish. But, of course, it's an impeachment, so that doesn't mean he's actually going to be removed. That means that there's going to be a trial in which they'll see if he should be removed. So it may yet be the case that he survives. We'll see. But I'm not holding my breath. I did think it was interesting that it wasn't actually the bad behavior that finally got him. It was the lying about it that got him. I don't quite remember exactly what it was. It had something to do with trying to do a favor for a friend or get some money or something. And so, you know, that was skeevy enough in and of itself. But when he was questioned about it by the legislature, he just openly lied about it. And so that was enough to finally trigger the impeachment proceedings. I would like to think standards would be higher such that you wouldn't need the lying, that it would be enough just to investigate and see that there's just obvious corruption going on. But it's Texas, so take what you can get, I guess.
God bless Texas. It's definitely an interesting state.
Yeah, I was trying to learn a little bit about the Texas economy last week. I was looking at some data, trying to figure out what the comparative advantage in Texas was. And it's very mixed now. There's not really one thing that stands out. Well, obviously oil and, you know, petroleum refining, that stands out. Obviously, that's like the big thing. But there's also a number of other industries that survive and thrive in Texas. And there's not really any one of them that really stands out all that much. I guess that's a sign that the diversification effort in the 80s worked, but it's a little confusing. I was kind of looking for like a couple of main economic drivers I could point to and say, okay, that's the Texas economy. But as is, there's just too many like middling categories, you know, stuff that we're relatively strong in, but not necessarily dominant in. There's a pretty wide range of stuff there in that sense.
Chat, we're not talking about abortion still. We talked about abortion an hour ago. Actually, we didn't even talk about abortion. I've talked about this before we started and how there are certain topics, I think this wasn't today, but I've said this many times on stream. There are certain topics where different sides of a political spectrum are never going to make any ground. And that's just how it is, just because they see the situation in a fundamentally different way. And you can talk until the cows come home, until the sun comes up and the sun comes down. And as the moon waxes and the moon wanes, and you will change no one's opinion because people get really entrenched in their beliefs. So you can beat your chest on the hillside as much as you want, but it ends up being a big waste of time. So we're talking about different stuff. So this is your warning. We're not talking about abortion today. If you want to discuss that at a different time, you may do so, but it's gotten out of hand, so we're going to move on.
Yeah, that's been in the news, but I hadn't really been following it too closely.
Oh, we weren't talking about a particular news item. This is just fundamentally addressing the argument as though from the first time.
Yeah, good luck with that if you're trying to proselytize people. It ain't gonna work.
So I have the image that you sent, which is a lovely
Ah,
world map, and I'll show it on stream.
yeah, so those are basically the countries that have benefited the most from re-export, the re-export trade, more specifically. So, a lot of, because of the fallout from economic tensions between the United States and China, as well as between the United States and Russia, there's a lot of things that previously could flow directly from one country to the other, but now, in order to evade sanctions or tariffs or whatever, now flow through a third party country instead. And this is actually probably the main fallout from economic tensions, such as they have been between the United States and rival countries. It's not really the case that countries are completely cut off from technologies and goods that previously were, much more freely available. Rather, it's more just that they have to go through a more circuitous route in order to get to the final location, which does add cost. It is inconvenient. And it has resulted in some dislocation of, say, factories and investment. Some stuff that used to be produced in China or the United States now is produced in one of these third-party countries in order to kind of get around trade restrictions. But otherwise, trade continues apace, just with this added cost. But some countries in particular have benefited from this process, and that would be the countries that I highlighted in the map.
So there are
So
orange ones and yellow ones. What were those again?
Yeah, so the yellow ones are the ones that have been mostly impacted by re-export trade pertaining to trade between the United States and China. So, for example, there's a lot of low value type manufactured goods, light manufacturing industry type stuff that previously had been produced in China, but which was affected by the tariffs that were imposed during the Trump administration. And so for those industries that are more, well, for those products that are more labor intensive in nature, for which the production is more labor intensive in nature, a lot of the factories that produce those have been relocated to places like Thailand or Singapore or Malaysia, because those countries have not been impacted by tariffs that were enacted by the US government. So there's been some dislocation there. Now, the companies and the factories are still owned by Chinese nationals. So hypothetically, the United States still could be impacted if China were to decide to cut off the United States from trade. Presumably the owners of those factories could be coerced by the Chinese government into shutting down their factories, or perhaps some other form of coercion by Beijing. So, the dependency and the risk of the trade is still there, but the trade has just been moved to the benefit of Southeast Asia specifically. There's also been a lot of dislocation in the semiconductor trade. A lot of semiconductor exports that had been going directly to China are now going through other countries, and specifically places like Hong Kong and Singapore, probably more Singapore now, have been getting a lot of those. And those then get traded on to China. There's probably other countries involved, but the focal points seem to be in Southeast Asia. And the same can be said for various other electronics and other goods that have been going from China to the United States or vice versa. A lot of those go through Southeast Asia now as well. So, in so much as there's been greater construction of factories, foreign direct investment and whatnot into Southeast Asia because of this trade, Southeast Asia has definitely been a beneficiary of this sort of trade diversion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worth highlighting in that sense. You can consider this like one of the main geographical and economic impacts of Sino-American competition thus far. It's one you can very easily make a map of, without having to put up a bunch of graphs and data and whatnot. Now, for the orange-colored countries, those are countries that are basically just like Southeast Asia. They're beneficiaries of the re-export trade, but in their cases, they're more beneficiaries of re-exports between the United States and Russia, if not the West and Russia generally. So a lot of stuff that Russia had been importing from the West, like factory equipment, semiconductors, microchips, stuff like that, that had been just going directly to Russia from the West. Now they go through these countries instead and then go on to Russia.
So it's Turkey, and what are the other two?
The big one up top is Kazakhstan, and then the little one in the bottom is the United Arab Emirates.
Nice. Yeah, chat guessed the top one correctly. Good job, chat. And UAE.
Yeah, so Turkey's probably the main one. Turkey has not really participated in the sanctions regime that has been implemented by the West against Russia. And there's been relatively little effort to use, diplomatic coercion to try to push them into participating in that sanctions regime. So for now, Turkey is a major re-export hub, and Russia is able to get a lot of what they want, although not everything. It is inherently difficult to get a lot of the stuff they want sort of through these sort of informal channels. And probably there's going to be greater and greater pressure put on Russia and their various interlocutors in Turkey to try to inhibit the flow of those clandestine goods into Russia. So Turkey's the main one. Kazakhstan, to a lesser degree, they're a little more remote. But if it's just something like, say, car parts or what have you, that's pretty doable. One of the things I saw on a YouTube recently was that apparently you can still get Western cars imported into Russia, but the way that you get around it is by buying an incomplete version of the car. So basically you get the frame, it comes with the engine, but it doesn't have a lot of the other components, stuff like steering wheels, windows, wheels, that kind of stuff. So you can import that into Russia, and then basically you have to pay somebody to try to acquire the other parts and then assemble them into the final product, which is fairly expensive. The actual car itself, the incomplete version of the car, that's relatively affordable, but the expense is more in getting the parts. A lot of those parts are specialized and relatively expensive and hard to import. And then also you need to pay for the labor. And of course, you're going to charge through the nose for that, like you do with everything else. And the United Arab Emirates is kind of an interesting category. They are involved in the re-export trade for pretty much everything, not just, cars and electronics and other stuff. But the interesting thing about them is that they're also more involved in things like the social media scene. So, there's a lot of social media people in Russia that have kind of had their relationship with their customers outside of Russia complicated by the restrictions placed on Russian banks. The financial sanctions have very much disrupted the ability of social media influencers and other media operatives in Russia to get paid by people outside of the country. So say if you have a sponsor outside of the country who had been paying you to promote their goods as part of your channel or what have you, they have basically struggled to find ways to pay you and to continue that relationship. So one way to get around those restrictions is to actually just fly to Dubai in the UAE, and then you can film, whatever your social media stuff is there, and then get paid there.
Yeah, you can also just set up a bank account and stuff for yourself, probably.
Exactly. So you can set up a bank account there and get paid. You can promote your material there, film your videos. Basically, it's a kind of social media re-export. And so Dubai has definitely benefited from that. Dubai has also gotten a lot of really wealthy Russians who are looking to kind of get out of Russia so that they can continue to have access to all of the sorts of Western luxury goods that they're used to having access to. So Dubai is definitely like a major focal point for them as well. So yeah, there's a kind of, I guess another way I could put it is to call Dubai a kind of financial re-export center for Russians.
Yeah, I know of quite a few people actually who are not just influencers per se, but I would say some kind of online content creator who's based in Russia who chose to leave the country basically for that reason, where the normal channels where they were getting paid from their international audience were no longer working for themselves. So they left, or they were concerned about military conscription and decided to leave for that reason. Yeah, it's really interesting how the online community is very global, and you don't really think about what country you're from a lot of the time. At least I don't. Like, we're internet kids and we do this or that other thing on the internet, but many of us don't really have like a super gung-ho reason to be a nationalist for our particular country.
Yeah. Yeah, the internet is a kind of inherently transnational in nature. It has kind of an inherently cosmopolitan culture. which can kind of make it surreal, when wars break out and trade wars break out. It's the breakdown in international order, such as it is, has kind of occurred in almost a different universe than the internet in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there was like what was it? It was something on Reddit where there was like two guys in a World of Warcraft thing. They were like they were in the same league or
Guild.
There you go. Thank you. And it turned out that one of them was Russian and one of them was Ukrainian.
Ah.
Which can be a little awkward depending on the personalities involved.
Yeah. But the people in the guild were not the ones who decided to go to war, so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it is nice to have that kind of relatively neutral space that everybody can go to.
Mm-hmm.
But, if things continue to deteriorate in global affairs, that weird juxtaposition between online culture and online neutrality and between the rest of the world and real world events is only going to grow starker.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of makes me wonder about the prophesied fragmenting of the internet. That's been talked about a lot over time. Different countries are erecting more and more barriers between internet access in their own country and stuff, websites, what have you, outside of their country. Mm-hmm. And it could be that we have, instead of a single international internet, instead we could have a series of siloed national internets that are separate from each other. So that could well be the future if things continue apace.
Kind of related to this, not exactly. I was hanging out with my friend Apoptosis, and we were talking about the .tv and how a lot of the different dot and then different whatever letters are representing a country, and TV is Tuvalu.
Yep.
But people use it for all kinds of different, like, gaming website, like twitch.tv is a .tv. Mm-hmm. Is it a company from Tuvalu? Not really, but it looks cool.
Yeah, Pacific Island countries love doing stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy money for them.
How does it benefit them?
Because it's a national thing. Basically you do get some fees from it.
That's cool.
You have to register it or something, I think. Somebody more knowledgeable about the subject is free to correct me on that. I would be interested in their input on it, but that is my understanding. Mm-hmm. There's lots of little tricks like that Pacific Island countries use to try to get a little extra revenue. Basically, they're just free riding and rent seeking on the fact that they are technically independent countries, even though they're just tiny and basically have no ability to protect their own sovereignty.
Go get them, Tuvalu. Collect those fees.
Yeah, I think another one is like registering ships. Mm-hmm. Kind of like with Panama or Greece. I think those are the main ones, but I think some of the Pacific Island nations also do that. They just make it very, very cheap to apply for permits and to get registered. And so a lot of ship makers and merchant firms, whatnot, maritime firms, they'll go and register their ships under their flags just to save a little bit of money. Mm-hmm. And I think there was at least one major pirate website that's set up in a Pacific Island nation in order to get around any potential, legal action. I think they were hoping that they could make enough money there that the government would not really take action against them. I don't think it ended up working out, but there was an effort in that. There was an effort to do so.
There was an attempt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember all the Pirate Bay drama and stuff of them trying to continue to exist as the U.S. chased them around the earth.
Yeah, that was a big deal back in the aughts.
Yep. Been a bit since I've been aware of the piracy scene and so on, but in college that was all the rage because college students got no money, so...
Yeah.
You want to watch movies and got no money? Well...
Oh yeah, I definitely remember those days.
There are methods of questionable legality available to you. Would you like to know more?
Yeah, something college students in America and China had in common at the time. Lots of similarities there. Now, let's see. Well, we looked at the re-export stuff. Did we talk about developing countries in China?
Developing countries in China? I don't think so.
And China, specifically the interaction between them.
I don't think so.
Okay, so that could be worth getting into a little bit. So, China supposedly is trying to kind of expand its influence in world affairs and trying to create a new world order, such as it is, that is going to be safe for autocracy, as opposed to safe for democracy. So that has been the source of considerable consternation, especially in Western countries. But it does beg the question as to just how much China has actually been able to build its influence in the developing world. And, really the answer is not that much. Certainly in terms of building economic dependency on, things like investment, exports, imports, etc., China's been very successful in that regard. And so that does give them a lot of economic leverage. But as far as building alliances, building friendships, alliances, etc., that has not happened and does not really seem set to. So, among the problems that China has is that it tends to be very self-interested, like just at all times. Like the United States, while self-interested, does have alliances that are predicated on things beyond pure self-interest. There are commonalities between, say, Europe and Japan and the United States as far as liberal democracy, rule of law, etc. China does not predicate its relationships on these kinds of soft power considerations. Its relationships are almost exclusively transactional in nature. And that's had some unfortunate side effects from their perspective over time. When they were just kind of handing out money as part of Belt and Road projects back in the day, that made them very popular. But that money invariably was handed out as part of loans, right? So there was an expectation that they would actually get paid back at some point. And because COVID-19 blew a hole in the balance sheets of virtually every developing country on the planet, a lot of those countries are now asking for debt forgiveness, or at least to refinance their loans, or to renegotiate them. And the IMF generally takes the lead on that, historically speaking. But at this point, not all of the loans held in the developing world are IMF loans. A lot of them are from China, basically bilateral loans issued by the Chinese government or by state-owned enterprises that are effectively owned by the Chinese government. And as these negotiations have continued, it's become apparent that the Chinese government is not really that interested in significantly forgiving the debt that was issued. And that's actually become a big problem because the IMF, as well as other private sector lenders, do not want to issue any kind of debt agreement that would result in debt forgiveness or whatnot without Chinese participation. And the issue from their perspective is that they feel that if they do, allow these countries to forgive some of their debt or to, extend their debt or what have you, then the proceeds from that are just going to go towards paying off Chinese loans. So in the short run, China gets paid back, and then everybody else gets screwed, and possibly they don't get paid back at all, depending on how the economies in question perform. So in order to avoid China just getting paid off first and then the other lenders getting ignored, the other lenders, IMF, private sector, they have demanded that China participate in these negotiations. And until they do, they have said that they are not willing to issue any substantive debt reform programs. And so a lot of developing countries that are the most in debt to China are the ones that have been most affected by this. And a lot of them have been effectively, well, not cut off from debt markets, but a lot of them have seen their credit rating deteriorate sharply in the expectation that no debt reform is pending and that their finances are, well, to use a layman term, pretty well fucked. That being the case, finances and economic performance in the developing world are deteriorating correspondingly because the governments in question just cannot get the financing they need in order to pay for various public services or to service existing debt, such that they can try to deal with the issue. And there's been some instability in a number of emerging markets correspondingly. So, China has its reasons for doing that. It does have to take care of its own interests first, but it does kind of put to lie this notion that China is going to behave differently than, previous powerful countries in the developing world. They are putting pressure on these countries to pay them off first and to kind of try to eschew other lenders. Now, one of the reasons for concern here, if you're the IMF, is that there actually were secret agreements made as part of these bilateral loans that were made by China to recipient countries in the developing world. And these actually involved escrow accounts, secret escrow accounts at that, in which the country that was borrowing the money would put money. This was not money that was supposed to go towards paying off the loan, mind you. That was a separate thing. Like, they were still on the hook to repay the loan, and they would still be expected to make regular payments. But as part of the secret agreement, there was also a secret escrow account that money was expected to be put in temporarily. Basically, money would be put here that could be taken out if the country wanted to. But there was expected to be some minimal amount at any given time. And this escrow account was meant to be an account that would be tapped in the event that the country could not pay off its loan. So it was kind of a secret reserve that was set aside specifically to help pay off loans made to China. And this money was not set aside for any other loans that were taken. Like, that money was not going to be used for IMF loans or for loans made by the private sector. And again, these escrow accounts were not made public. And the fact that these escrow accounts existed has made basically everybody else who lent money to them paranoid, because they don't know how extensive these secret agreements went. There could well be other agreements that inherently favor Chinese lenders over other lenders. And so, in so much as that there's a risk that, Chinese lenders have this advantage, other lenders feel very reluctant to try to come in and lend further money. Because they feel that, if the shit hits the fan and the country can't pay out, then they're likely to be on the hook. Keep in mind, if you're favoring one lender over another, then it's that much more unlikely that the other lender will get paid eventually if you are encountering financial difficulties. So that also is a factor here in why a lot of developing countries are having more trouble borrowing money. Because these secret agreements were so extensive, there's a sense that there's much greater risk in lending to emerging markets than private lenders and the IMF were previously aware of. And the adjustment has involved lending less money, basically, until all of this can be cleared up to their satisfaction. Also, in general, there's a lack of coordination between Beijing and the West. Again, Western institutions like the IMF have tried to communicate with China in order to come to some kind of agreement here, because it is recognized that it's a problem for the global economy if these countries are cut off from debt and have to cut public services correspondingly. But there's just been no traction there in those negotiations. And so you can consider that kind of a part of the broader chill in relations between China and the West, that there's a seeming unwillingness to cooperate on this issue. So again, all of that favors China, but it isn't doing much for their image in the developing world. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't worry. Basically, this is meant to kind of illustrate that while there is some reason to worry about Chinese influence in the rest of the world, it's a little bit overblown. Because the reality is that Beijing is not really that skilled at building their reputation in the developing world right now. Maybe in the future they will be, but for now they're making some big mistakes. And it's really undercutting any claim that they might have made towards being more benevolent in their treatment of relations with developing countries.
Yep, trust is a really big thing when it comes to where you put your money. There is the option to gamble with it to an extent, but yeah, whenever things are looking volatile, you don't really want to get into that, even if there is a lot of growth.
Yeah,
it's growth that's going to eventually turn into a bust.
Yeah, trust is a vital commodity. It's hard to measure or operationalize, but in things like diplomacy or lending or what have you, or even just interpersonal relationships,
Mm-hmm.
trust is extremely important.
Hard to build and easy to burn.
Exactly. And the world right now is very much into burning things, fortunately. So there's not a lot of trust to go around, alas. Well, let's see. So what is it? About 30 minutes left now?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think we had. Oh, wait. Yeah, we did. Okay. So another question. What are the ramifications of U.S. becoming independent in terms of energy, goods, and the general ability to sustain itself? Well, I don't really think we're on that path right now. I mean, we're focusing on China as far as decoupling goes, but we're still trading a lot with, say, Europe, a lot of emerging markets. Really, we're still trading a lot with China, for that matter. So, in terms of like manufactured goods and stuff, we're not really going to be all that much more self-sufficient than we were before. Even in the case of goods and factories that are being, quote unquote, reshored or ally shored or near shored or whatever your favorite term is. A lot of that stuff is not coming back to the United States. It's coming back to places like Mexico, or in the case of Europe, Poland, basically sort of these cheap manufacturing centers where stuff can be assembled and then exported on. So you could consider those sort of secondary beneficiaries of the re-export trade, Mexico, Poland, etc. But that's not going to make us like more self-sufficient, in so much as self-sufficient is defined as depending and consuming on stuff produced within your own borders. That's not really what's happening here. I guess to put it another way, the death of globalization has been greatly exaggerated. It's not really going away. It's just being calibrated specifically as far as areas of trade that involve goods and services that are sensitive to what can be considered the national security of this, that, or the other country, specifically the United States and China, if not also Europe. In terms of energy, yeah, definitely we're becoming more self-sufficient. That has to do with the shale revolution, fracking, et cetera. So, in that sense, we're a lot less dependent on imports from, say, the Middle East. And in so much as that's the case, we are correspondingly less, less dependent on stability in the Middle East. So one could argue that because we are self-sufficient in energy, we don't have to care about the Middle East anymore, and we should just leave and, leave them to their own devices. And that's not going to happen. The reason the United States was interested in the Middle East was not just due to energy. It was also because that's a strategic reason, just geographically speaking. And also, the fact that we consume most of our energy does not mean that the price of that energy is not influenced by the price of energy in other regions. So even if we're not consuming oil from the Middle East, if they start producing a lot more or a lot less, that inherently influences the price not only of their own oil and other resources, but also of oil and other resources produced in the United States. Because we do have global trade, prices in one region result in arbitrage in other regions, and the result is that global prices tend to at least move together, even if they aren't always, exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So if there were a major spike in, say, oil prices in the Middle East, the price of oil in the United States would go up. We're not in any danger of being embargoed again, like we were in the 70s. So in so much as that's the case, we have a lot more strategic autonomy, which is good. But as far as, say, the consumer being at risk of foreign pressure, that's still a problem. Like if they want to punish the U.S., they could hike oil prices and U.S. consumers would get squeezed. We're still in danger of that. So that hasn't gone away, even if we are energy independent now. So overall, yes, there's been a shift towards energy independence, and that's created more strategic autonomy, but we are still vulnerable to the point where we can't just completely withdraw from the rest of the world. If another power were to dominate, say, the Middle East, they could do a lot of damage if they wanted to, just by dint of influence over energy markets. And yeah, again, as far as goods and the general ability to sustain itself, the rest of the question, we're still not anywhere near being self-sufficient on that count. We're still very much deeply involved in international trade and very much interdependent with other regions. And, I would add, that's not a bad thing, right? Having free trade is a good thing. It is good to have a broader range of people trading with each other, because then you can take advantage of different regions and countries, different comparative advantages. And even if the United States, this is Ricardian theory for you, even if the United States is better at producing everything, free trade is still beneficial, because we can still diversify who's producing it, which results in lower costs and greater price efficiency. It's kind of more of an abstract argument. Again, it's Ricardian economics, but fundamentally, mathematically, that is inherently true. So we are better off with the global trade. And I would add, just kind of as a side note, that while there are some sensitive goods that the United States could do to be more self-sufficient in, stuff like maybe semiconductors or whatnot, a lot of the stuff we're trading for is not necessarily critical. If the stuff we're buying from China is like toys and sex toys and stuff like that, then it doesn't really matter if they cut us off, right? That's not like a big strategic liability. So I'm not worried about
Depends on who you ask, but yes.
Well, it depends on who I am. But, as far as light manufacturing, it's not that big a deal. Like, China produces a lot of textiles, but it wouldn't be that hard to diversify away from them. We would have more expensive shirts for a while. Like, that's okay. We can handle that. Even if it takes like a year, to build a new factory or to retool an existing factory and to try to make up the production shortfall, like, that's imminently doable. That's not a big strategic threat. China's not going to scare the U.S. off supporting China, because pants are a little more expensive.
We'll hit him in the pants.
Yeah. So, textiles, toys, light manufacturing, generally, that's not the problem. Bigger problem would be something like rare earths, which China definitely specializes in. But there are active efforts to try to create more diversification in that particular supply chain as well. There's efforts to start rare earths mining in Nevada, or just the West in general in the United States. There's lots of red tape there that's making the process last way too long, but technically that is happening.
What are the rare earths and how rare are they?
I couldn't name them all by memory. Basically, they're like the minerals that are at the end of the periodic table, the really fancy sounding ones. But they're actually pretty common. They're not really rare at all. You can find them virtually anywhere. They're not, when you think of like a metal or a material, you think of like a concentrated material in the ground that you have to extract, like iron ore, right? Yeah. You find iron ore or coal or something in a big concentrated area, and then you mine that out of the ground. Rare earths are not like that. It's not like they're concentrated it's not like they're hard to find in concentrations anywhere. You really don't find them concentrated anywhere. Rather, what makes them rare is that you don't find very much of them per, parts per million, basically. They're not constant. You can't find them anywhere in any concentrated degree, but you can find them in any given material, basically, to some degree. So the real challenge with rare earths is not finding them, it's in refining them. You basically just have to filter out all the other crap and then try to get what you can. And because they are found in only such minute concentrations, it takes a lot of random stuff. You have to filter a lot of random material out in order to get even very small amounts. So when people talk about China having a monopoly on rare earths, they're not saying that China has a monopoly on deposits of rare earths. Everybody has rare earths. What China has a monopoly on is the refining of rare earths. And the reason they have a monopoly on the refining of rare earths is that it's an extremely polluting process. It creates a lot of really toxic runoff. And again, because you do have to filter out most of the material that you process in order to get a very tiny amount of rare earths, the result is that just an immense amount of runoff. Like, it's a lot. And the cleanup is very expensive. The United States used to be self-sufficient in the refining of rare earths materials. But after the Cold War ended, actually maybe even just before the Cold War ended, a lot of environmental regulations were passed that made it cost prohibitive in the United States. And eventually international competition, specifically from China, basically led all of the rare earths refiners in the United States to close shop. And as a result, the United States, as well as pretty much everybody else around the world, just bought them from China. So of course, the downside for China is that they have a lot of pollution, right? They basically monopolize not only the rare earths materials, but also all of the negative externalities that come with poisoning their own environment. But from the perspective of the Chinese government, that's a worthwhile price to pay to have a stranglehold on one of the most important items in the modern economy. So being self-sufficient in that would be nice, and there have been efforts to move in that direction. Some of the environmental regulations have been watered down a little bit to try to make it more profitable for American producers to kind of start producing again. But even if the United States doesn't become like a major producer again, that's not necessarily a problem, because there are countries like Australia and to a lesser degree Chile that also produce them. Australia in particular is a big producer. They also produce materials like lithium, which is not actually a rare earth, but is important to a lot of new technologies, especially batteries, which are going to be like a big deal going forward. So, producers like Australia are pretty reliable, and they could, if they get enough investment, come to rival China. They may not be able to produce as much as China, but they'll be able to produce enough to supplant China in the case of an emergency, which is the objective there. So rare earths could be a problem, I would grant you that. But we're already in the process of trying to address that, albeit, very belatedly and very slowly. But yeah, beyond rare earths, there's not necessarily too much to worry about. There are a couple, maybe electrical equipment could be a problem. China has a lock on the electrical equipment market, although the United States has been pushing them out of that market over time. There's been a lot of regulations there by the FCC to kind of try to push them out of the electrical equipment. When I say electrical equipment, I'm not talking about like electronics. I'm talking about equipment relevant to the generation and distribution of electricity. So that specific market is one that Chinese exporters have come to dominate over time. But because the federal government doesn't trust Chinese producers, and the Chinese government in particular, there's been more and more moves made to try to push them out of the market and get American consumers, well, specifically utilities and localities, to try to buy those goods from other producers, not from China. Basically to diversify away from China.
Fuzzyquid's saying two of the main rare earths that are in high demand are tantalum and neodymium. And tantalum is used for small capacitors for electronics, and neodymium is for high-strength magnets.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So it seems like it's a pretty valuable market, but your country now counts as stinky. So any effects that are influenced by the stinky factor are going to be not good, such as people with lung conditions.
Yeah, and it gets in the water supply, and it's not great. It basically poisons the land, so it's hard to grow stuff. Mm-hmm. There's a number of negative, repercussions that come with it. So it's not ideal. Yeah, I think maybe a bigger problem as far as dependence on China would be stuff like medical equipment, because China does produce a lot of that, as well as a lot of other, types of electronics and stuff like that. That is maybe more important to, say, survival or other, key operations, maybe to infrastructure, stuff like that. So, it could be difficult to find replacements in the event of an emergency in those cases. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, the U.S. government has not focused as much on goods like those. Generally the focus has been more on AI chips, semiconductors more broadly, but AI chips in particular, and also things like quantum computing, biotechnology, encryption is another one. Yeah, there's basically cutting edge technologies in general Washington has been particularly focused on. Rare earths, they're aware of that and are taking action on that. But other than that, I have not really seen like a systematic effort either inside or outside Washington, that is to say, inside or outside of the government, to really systematically review supply chain interdependence between the United States and China in order to try to tease out and identify key choke points that China might use in order to pressure the United States. I don't know that anybody has really done that. So I think they're focusing on like the most strategically important items. Again, the ones that tie into high-tech stuff seems to be the emphasis. And then lower priority items that could be important but are not necessarily strategic backbreakers, like, say, medical equipment. Those are not really receiving much of any attention right now. Maybe in the future, when more systematic review is done, or if something happens that makes those items more important politically or possibly strategically, maybe then there would be more focus. But for now, they're having to prioritize because, the trade between the United States and China is just so immense that a systematic review is just would take an extraordinary amount of time, a lot of manpower, and would just be difficult all around. And so in lieu of that, they're kind of picking and choosing their battles right now. So some interdependence is inevitable, possibly even desirable, in so much as China does have some comparative advantages there. And that's pretty much inevitable. Even if you tried to block them, you'd also then just have to deal with the re-export trade. And that would mean trying to get third-party countries to participate in sanctions and export restrictions and whatnot. And a lot of them are probably not going to be that interested in that. A lot of them are probably going to be pretty happy to just make the extra money that comes from being a re-export hub. So that would be a very difficult diplomatic challenge for the United States in order to really manage. So most likely international trade is here to stay.
Yeah, you need to present to them some competitive, better solution.
Yeah, exactly. I might add, as far as re-export, it's not just Chinese stuff that gets re-exported into the United States, or for that matter, American, technology that gets re-exported to China in order to get around sanctions. There's also a lot of American food that gets re-exported into China. Because China, in retaliation for U.S. tariffs, put tariffs on American food and made the effort to diversify Chinese consumption away from American foodstuffs towards South American foodstuffs.
What were we sending them?
Huh?
What were we sending them? What kinds of food?
I think mainly soy, and also maybe pork and chicken as well. But I think soy is the big one. Soybeans, specifically.
Damn, pork and chicken shipped across an ocean?
It's doable.
Ugh.
I think a lot of that had to do with flu, like swine flu and bird flu. Because I think a couple of years ago, I think 2017 it was later than that. It would have been like 2019. There was a big swine flu epidemic in China, and it wiped out like big swaths of their swine herd, and they had to respond to that. They had to rebuild their swine herd in part by importing lots of pigs from the United States. So it's not like meat per se that they're importing. It's more like the actual pigs.
Oh. Damn, that's crazy.
Well, China's not self-sufficient in food. Technically they are the largest producer of food in the world, but it's not enough to cover all of their needs because the population is so large. So they actually do need to import, food to try to meet that demand.
Huh. So their population is only possible because of globalization.
Yeah, you could say that. To a degree. Maybe with rationing, they could be self-sufficient if they needed to, but it would be difficult and probably very uncomfortable, as well as unpopular. It's especially bad for China because as the country has gotten wealthier, people have diversified their diets. They don't want to just eat, rice and vegetables anymore. They want to eat a lot more beef, a lot more pork, more chicken. And so that's kind of put a strain on some of their agriculture because a lot of their producers are not very efficient. One of the big pushes that the Chinese government has made over the past 5 years has been trying to get agricultural producers to be more efficient. Not only to allow them to produce more food, for the population, but, in part also to generate a labor surplus. They want to try to get workers off of the farm and more of them into the city. so that they can continue to urbanize and develop the economy. Urbanization is a big part of development. So they're kind of hoping to try to continue that process, to try to create a consumer-driven economy. Kind of mixed results last I checked. Also, they want farmers to be smart enough not to overuse antibiotics. That's also been a problem. Mm-hmm. That just, over time, that creates more drug-resistant bacteria and other, types of microbes. And that could be very bad, if they eventually do evolve past the ability of existing drugs to deal with them. Mm. So, every part of the world is guilty of that to one degree or another, but the developed world in particular has tried to address that and tried to reduce the use of antibiotics. But there's a lot of producers in the developing world, including China, that have not really progressed as much in that regard. And the result is that there's a dangerous dependence on antibiotics as a result. So the Chinese government recognizes that and has tried to kind of make some improvement there by trying to modernize the industry. I think the U.S. also exports a fair amount of wheat to China, but I'd have to check. I can't quite remember. Soybeans definitely, possibly also wheat.
Did not know that.
But like I said, they've diversified away from U.S. producers and tried to buy more from South American producers. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese government has the same problem the U.S. government does in trying to direct that, which is that it's possible to sell those products to a third-party country, to some kind of interlocutor, and to have them then sell that on to China without Chinese customs being any the wiser. Mm-hmm. So overall, American producers have lost market share in China, but it's probably not as much as the Chinese government would have liked. So I guess to answer the question, I'm kind of belaboring the question, but it's an interesting one. So I'm kind of going in different directions. What are the ramifications of the U.S. becoming independent in terms of these different things? We're not really becoming fully independent, so it's not that impactful in that sense. But in so much as we are, I don't even in that case think it's that impactful. Because really, again, we're not ending globalization; we're just adjusting it. Mm. And I don't think the U.S. is really seeking to be like a fully what's the word? I need to read more economics. It's been too long. Well, anyway, the U.S. doesn't want to be fully self-sufficient. That's just not really fully achievable. And even in so much as it is, it's not really that desirable. So I don't think the ramifications are that big. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think it's really happening. Basically, autarky, that's the word I wanted. An autarky is a totally closed economy. It's not one that trades with at all with any other economy. So the U.S. is not trying to become an autarky. That's not what we're going for.
Autarky, spelled like A-U-T-O?
A-U-T-A-R-K-Y.
Autarky. Yeah, economic independence or self-sufficiency. Yeah, you can say self-sufficient too. Basically, by virtue of engaging in global trade, we can buy stuff for cheaper than we could self-produce it. Even though we could, you can just invest in other markets and different areas of growth for yourself.
Yeah. And I would point out, too, that by engaging in global trade, the United States wields a considerable amount of economic influence over other countries, and that this economic influence is one of the main ways that the U.S. Exerts influence in the world. So we spend a lot on the military, but the military by itself would not be able to achieve nearly as much as concern over losing access to the U.S. market, or otherwise losing access to, say, U.S. finance, or U.S. software, or U.S. goods in general. Mm-hmm. Those threats carry a lot more weight than, say, a carrier battle group, or a submarine, or even nuclear weapons. So it would actually be something, well, you could say it would be strategically self-defeating for the United States to become an autarky. We would actually be more vulnerable, not less, to the rest of the world at that point.
You're saying we shouldn't pull a Brexit.
Yeah. But Brexit is not the move here.
Yeah.
So I would argue. Well, let's see. We did have one more question, and I'm guessing, not that much time left?
Yeah, we're not in a rush, but yeah, we can hit the question and then wrap.
All right. Let's see. Does Agent Smith have any opinions on situations where China overexploits what would be considered international resources, for example, overfishing? It's bad. I mean, in so much as I have an opinion on it, then yeah, I do not approve of overexploitation. That's not really sustainable. I mean, as far as a broader commentary than that, it's not that surprising. I mean, as a developing economy, there's a lot of people that are desperate in China, or at least are ambitious. And so, they tend to go pretty hard. Fishing being a prime example. It's not like there's a lot of super wealthy fishermen out there. Although I'm sure there are some large fishing companies that are probably disproportionately responsible. But, for the most part, yeah, I don't necessarily begrudge them, for trying to kind of get by.
Yeah, the overlap between the animal rights activists and the fishermen is not super large because the fishermen are trying to sell a good at the best price possible, and they also want to make their operations as cheap as possible. One of the things that is another consequence of heavy fishing industry is just garbage in the ocean, because that's it is the cheapest place to throw your garbage, is just drop it off your boat, which for the company that saves them money of what they would have otherwise had to dispose of it in a environmentally sound way, but ultimately it ends up affecting the quality of the wildlife and the ecosystems in the ocean, which is something that does come back to bite us, but much later than what they're benefiting from financially. And that's one of the points that we're kind of in the current process of becoming aware of, is the short term versus the long term. Short term is what are you getting this quarter from what you're doing? The long term is, how is this industry going to be sustainable over the next decades or centuries? And the second part is a lot more abstract and difficult to really get people motivated to push for. I've been vegan for 10 months now, so I've been kind of browsing a lot more of that media and trying to raise people's awareness of the different ways that we're not really having a high regard for our environment or other wildlife and that kind of thing. And it's interesting how there is, like I was saying, no overlap between the people who are trying to sell these goods and services, and they're trying to do the most effective monetary business they can, and then people who are trying to advocate for the ethics of the situation. They're different groups. So that's one of the conversations that's going to continue to unfold throughout our generation, is just how our businesses and things are going to affect the world. Like you're talking about with this rare earths thing, it could be an industry that makes them a lot of money, but if it comes at a really high cost, then their citizens have to pay the cost, and they're basically going to endure pain until they're willing to fight for change. And I think that is a Kukio quote. I don't know where he got it, but he said, change happens when the pain to remain the same becomes too great.
Yep, I remember that.
Yep. One of the classics.
That's still missing.
It's a very sobering quote, too, because a lot of people get frustrated that change isn't happening fast enough, and that is the reminder that it has to hurt for you to change. There has to be a really good reason to, otherwise the status quo is the most comfortable position.
Yeah. Well, I would add that fishing is maybe also not the best example here, because that's kind of unique. Not a lot of countries are heavily dependent on, say, fishing, and in so much as there are countries that are dependent on fishing, China just happens to be the largest, so unsurprisingly, they have the largest fishing fleet. Mm-hmm. So, if there were another country with an even larger fishing fleet, they would probably be the ones getting bitched out for, overfishing rather than China.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a size thing more than a China thing in that sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think speaking on materials other than fish, in terms of like raw resources, I mean, China definitely consumes a lot, but it's not consuming a lot to give its people a standard of living that's necessarily on par with the West. It is still a middle income country, and there are broad swaths of China that do not even have that level of development. And so, it's not like they're just resource stripping whole regions of the world for nothing, right? They are just trying to kind of get ahead. They are trying to make lives better for their people.
Mm-hmm.
But there are examples, I think, where you could make a much stronger case where they are just over exploiting. So something like, say, pangolins. Have you heard of them?
Pangolins, that's like the little echidna creature.
I don't know what echidna is, but you
It's like a
probably know more
hedgehog
about
looking
it.
thing.
Yeah. It's got like scales and stuff.
Do you know how I know this? This is a nerd moment. Pangolier is a Dota 2 hero that looks like an echidna. Thanks, video games.
There you go. Well done.
They're called pangolins, you said?
Yeah, I believe so, if memory serves. They're found on
pangolin.
They're not in China. They're actually only found outside of China.
Oh, pangolin.
Specifically on an island called Palawan, which is an island in the Philippines. It's a big, long island. It's pretty easy to spot. But they have been, their scales, I believe specifically, are a key ingredient to certain concoctions in traditional Chinese medicine.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
They want so many different animal parts, it's pretty messed up.
Yeah, rhino horns, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, But pangolins are one of them, and it's an endangered species. So, they're very expensive, but, because China has grown so much economically over time, more and more people can afford it. And the result has been a lot of hunting of pangolins. And it has had an effect on the population. So, yeah, I think that could be a good example of overexploitation by China. Although, to be fair, that's not the Chinese government or companies. That's just, individual Chinese indulging in traditional Chinese medicine. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, you can consider it basically just a manifestation of the nouveau riche status of China at this point. Whenever a country develops economically, there's always a transition period between the time when it's poor and the time when it is an established wealthy country. Mm-hmm. That transitional period sees a lot of poor people become rich, and they take some of the bad habits with them, right? They live in a modern world, but they kind of grew up in a poor traditional one. And so in the case of, say, Chinese traditional medicine, there's a lot of people that just grew up with that. And when they have money, they spend money on it. They think that, the dick pills will really work if I have actual pangolin scales in them.
Yeah, it says that they believe that their ground-up scales can stimulate lactation or cure cancer or asthma.
There you go.
And they're trafficked to Vietnam and China. It's about 100,000 of them per year. And they're all either threatened or critically endangered. And it looks like on the map of this, they're present in Africa and India and Southeast Asia. They're also armored and cute, and they look like a Pokemon. Philippine pangolins. There's Indian pangolins. They curl up to defend themselves against lions, and they're like, what do we do? It's armored.
But to be fair to China, it's a transitional thing, right? There's probably a lot of people in China who are more environmentally minded, especially the younger population, who do not do that, right? Who do not participate in that trade, and who actively advocate for the government to clamp down on it. Mm-hmm. So most likely that's a trade that will eventually decline and maybe extirpate at some point. Mm-hmm. Once the country has been, has kind of uplifted enough people into modernity to kind of to make people aware of the cost, at least, of some of the concoctions in question, such that demand is undermined and people stop hunting for these pangolins, an endangered species.
Mm-hmm.
So you could probably say the same for other examples of overexploitation that stems from Chinese consumption. We're just in that transitional phase before consumption becomes more informed and responsible in China.
Yeah. And then one of the reminders, as you're mentioning here, of not everyone in China is in favor of stuff like this. No country is a monolith. I think a lot of times we just take the mental shortcut of thinking that insert group here is all on the same page about some kind of thing. China has over 1 billion people. So
Oh, yeah.
for the amount of this event that's occurring, it's going to be a very small fraction of the population that's participating in that. And you're going to have people who are for and against it. To reference the heated debate in chat earlier, Democrats and Republicans also are not monoliths, where that's a label that can be prescribed to a person who may be more or less involved in the political party. Maybe they just voted for that party at some point, but they don't really identify as a member of that party. Like, I would say that I have voted for Republican candidates and Democratic candidates in the past, and I wouldn't really call myself either of those things. So try to keep a sober mindset when it comes to thinking about countries. Like we've said with Russia, not everyone in Russia voted on this war, so we don't need to demonize a whole country of people, and try to think about just citizens of the world trying to make sense of their reality and also just trying to get by with the circumstances that are around them.
I would add that Republican and Democrat are artificial identities created to make it easier to manage disparate interest groups that comprise coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say Republicans and Democrats, you're not really referring to anything. Like, the whole identity was contrived in the first place.
Yeah. Because you can
And as
basically think about all the issues and all the coalitions like a big grocery store, and you have certain things that are more on one side of the store than the other, but a given individual could maybe stand for one issue on one side and another issue on the other side. You
Yeah.
don't really need to take the whole side of the store.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, American politics is unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately in some cases, very good at creating artificial identities,
Mm-hmm.
up to and including, say, the American nationality itself.
Mm-hmm. I think the American nationality, one of our strengths has been inclusivity and just being a melting pot. Like, that's a big strength for us, where a person doesn't necessarily, and this isn't everyone again, but a person doesn't necessarily need to look a certain way to be American. All you need to do is be here. And we do have some expectations of you should be hardworking and all of those different Protestant work ethic shenanigans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, media has played a big role in that. Modern technology and specifically its interaction with media has allowed for the construction of maintenance of a much broader, more inclusive identity that might have been possible even just 100 or 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that sense, we're kind of riding the crest of the wave in a sense, as the country has become more ethnically diverse. However you want to define that over time, there have been corresponding improvements in media technology that have allowed for, well, I could argue perhaps, that have allowed for the improvement in the capacity of a state to create and maintain an artificial inclusive identity like that the United States does.
Mm-hmm.
So, at first, maybe the United States, when it was first founded 200 years ago, maybe given the way media technology was, like just how limited it was, maybe it would have been impossible for the United States to hold together with the degree of diversity that it has now, if it had had that degree of diversity at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, because the number of countries of people migrating to the U.S. was smaller at the start, and it's gotten more international as transportation has improved. You didn't really have people from like South Asia and Africa. Well, I guess some from Africa, but basically the further away from the continental U.S., the less likely you were to have migrants from there, whereas now you can take a flight from anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So, it could be that that degree of diversity would have been impossible before and very challenging even relatively recently. But it could also be that just given how much easier it is, to create artificial identities with something like the internet or, what have you, It could be that it's actually relatively manageable to create an artificial identity now. I mean, you can just look at all the niche identities that exist on the internet now, right? So, if the furries can have an identity that's inclusive, then why not America? Like, why can't we do that, but on a much larger scale, right? So you would think it would be much more doable. So, I guess you could say that's kind of part and parcel of a relationship the United States has with technology, because the country has very much evolved parallel to the Industrial Revolution and really just the improvement in the radical improvement in technology over time that has occurred over the past 200 years. To a degree, that scientific and technological development is itself a part of the American story, even if we have not always been responsible for it. I'm not trying to be a nationalist and say we created everything in the modern world. I'm saying that in so much as modern technology is relevant to the construction and maintenance of the American identity, it's critical. You can't really separate them. Steady improvement, higher quality of life, higher standard of living, all of that, steady and improving standard of living, that is to say, all of that is a part of the American identity. And that's tied into technological development and improvements that stem from it. And I don't know that that's the case in other places. Like in France, if you're ethnically French and you grew up in France, then you're French. It doesn't matter if the economy is better or worse, or what the government is. There's an inherent kind of blood and soil identitarianism that exists in Europe and really pretty much the entire old world that transcends things like technology or development or democracy or what have you. But in the United States, as well as just in the Western Hemisphere generally, we don't really have the luxury of blood and soil nationalism, right? It's not our soil, and the blood comes from all over the planet. So we have to take a much more complex, shall we say, approach to assimilation and construction of identities. And it's worked. Thus far, it has actually been very successful. I mean, that's maybe not something that's special about the United States. You could say the same thing about, say, Brazil, which has also received a lot of immigrants, or Argentina, or et cetera. But, there's something about the New World and our ability to just assimilate people into these sort of weird new identities that we ourselves created that has just been enormously effective. And I guess I would just argue that technology is a big part of that.
Yep. Well, whenever we make contact with aliens, then we can have more of an Earth identity. That'll be the next big step.
There you go. Independence Day was a documentary.
Yeah, they have big, spooky, scary aliens, but what about the very good-looking aliens?
I still haven't seen the sequel.
There's a sequel?
Yeah, Independence Day 2.
Really? When was that
Came
made?
out 2017? Is that when it was?
Oh, really? I didn't even know about this.
I remember Will Smith. They couldn't get Will Smith to come back. He wanted too much money or something, and so they killed him off in the first 5 minutes or something. Or no, they did an off-screen death, right? He had died before the events of the movie even started.
5.2 out of 10 on IMDb.
There you go.
The first Independence Day. 1996, 7 out of 10. So slightly better. I like this kind of movie, though. Scenarios of alien invasions and fighting against them and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Not always super highbrow, but pretty fun.
Oh, you know what that reminds? I've actually been doing. I was getting antsy about anime. I got interested in anime again. It kind of comes and goes. And so I got a Crunchyroll account. I figured I'd just do it for a month, just $10, since that's not expensive. And I've just kind of been going through some of the stuff on my list. And I did watch one alien invasion anime. It was, what was it? Razafon. That's an older one. That was back in the late 90s. Yeah, that was a mecha anime, basically giant robots fighting, that kind of thing. Yeah, Razafon has been on my list for a long time, but I hadn't gone around to it until last month or so. Very interesting.
Have you seen Parasite the Maxim? It's an anime.
Yeah. Actually, you and Michael recommended that to me back in the day.
Nice. Okay, good. I rewatched that one like 2 years ago, but that one holds up. It's really good. Synopsis: basically, they're in aliens that invade, and they're like tiny microbes, but they'll take over a human, and they really modify them and make them into these like grotesque, crazy killing machines. And the main character is basically one where the microbe landed in his body at the wrong spot, so it couldn't take over his brain, and then they end up figuring out how to work together, and they learn from each other and kind of fight against the invasion. It's really interesting. Lately, I've been watching Demon Slayer, which is like one of the hot new ones that's made from a really big studio. It has really great animation, basically just samurai versus demons. And then Vinland Saga is very, very good. The second season of it is going now. I'll link that to you in Discord or type it out. But that one is on Crunchyroll. And that one is really cool because it's like, I would say it's semi-historical. It deals with the actual Viking countries and has like actual kings and explorers who were part of Viking history. And it doesn't pull any punches in showing how brutal that lifestyle was. So it's not really romanticizing the Viking history, like all the raiding and the pillaging and the abuse of people and stuff. It's very dark, so don't watch it if you want to pick me up. But it's very well done. The combat looks really cool, and it has a really good story.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've heard that, well, I saw a YouTube video basically reviewing most of the anime released this season, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And apparently this is one of the strongest seasons in a long time. So there's a lot of good stuff out there now.
Nice. And chat or YouTube if you have any show recommendations. We're open.
Yeah, let us know. Always up for a good recommendation. Yeah, have you ever watched like mecha stuff, like mecha anime?
Yeah. Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann is my favorite one. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I remember you guys recommending it. It is on my list.
So Kukyo didn't finish watching it, and I wish he had, and you'll know why. There's a scene that is kind of in there that I really wanted him to see. So I would say you should absolutely watch that one. It's a very much like empowerment of the human spirit and fighting spirit, and it does have the crazy scale of it starts very low level of humans just trying to survive against the oppression of mechs to like really ascending to a crazy cosmic kind of scale. But it's not super long, so it's maybe 40 episodes, I think. Fairly short as far as anime go. That one is also on Crunchyroll.
Gotcha. Well, Razafan is a lot more artistic than that, I think. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like it would be like if an independent filmmaker and a music theory guy got together and made an anime. It's very kind of surreal and weird. I like it. Mm-hmm. It was fun. It was challenging sometimes. It kind of dragged at times, but yeah, it was definitely very unique. I can see why people remember it so fondly.
Nice. Well, best of luck with your show quests. I've been very happy with my Crunchyroll membership. Like relative to other like TV subscription models and stuff, the price point per how much content you get seems really good to me.
Yeah, it's basically like an infinite buffet that you get for $10 a month.
Yep. The infinite anime buffet. And it goes way back in time too, like old stuff from the 90s is on there too. Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff I didn't get to watch back in the day that I kind of still want to, so it's nice having that as an option. Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, have you ever heard of Visions of Escaflowne?
No.
So that's another mecha anime, but it's a medieval setting.
What?
Somewhat. Yeah, it's counterintuitive. It's a fantasy medieval setting, so it's not like Earth, but different world. And the unique thing about that is that the target demographic was not just like boys. They actually also targeted girls.
Huh.
And so that manifested as a plot that not only had, giant robot fighting, politics, etc., the usual mecha anime fare, but also it had a lot of romantic elements to it. Like there was a lot more time and energy invested into the romantic relationships between the characters.
From 94 to 97.
Yeah.
Damn.
So, I'm not big on romance per se, but I appreciated that it was doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually kind of did enjoy the journey. And it has a pretty decent story, too.
Mm-hmm.
So I give it credit for that. I think it kind of went under a lot of people's radar at the time because there was actually an American company that bought the rights to it.
Mm-hmm.
But when they showed the version of it that they showed in the United States was heavily butchered because they tried to sell it as a kids show,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a kids show. Like, there's lots of like gratuitous violence and some gore, and like it was not made for children, but they tried to force it, and the result was just a lot of just really bad edits, and yeah, it did not work. So I appreciate that I got to see the real version of it and not the Americanized version.
Nice. Well, cool. If there's anyone in the YouTube comments who has show suggestions for us, feel free to weigh in. My recommendations for you, I typed out in Discord.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I'll type out a few more as I think of them. Now that I know you have Crunchyroll. That's a thing that really is a hard wall for me with a lot of TV shows, is if I don't have the subscription to that platform, I just don't end up watching it. What's the one? Last Kingdom. So many people have told me that I look like Uhtred from Last Kingdom. It's on Netflix. I don't have Netflix, so I've never seen it. But if it's on Prime or Crunchyroll, I will watch it. They keep getting us with all these different subscriptions. Just let me watch shows.
Oh yeah, that's why I just do like 1 month and then I'm out,
Yeah.
because I don't watch all that much. If I do, I'll just binge a whole bunch at once. But then after that, I've noticed that I don't use it as much. So
Yeah.
it's pretty much binge or nothing for me at this point.
Yeah, chat's remembering when Netflix used to mail you DVDs.
I loved that.
That was the beginning of the end for Blockbuster. That's when people could have different movies to watch and not have to put on pants. Blockbuster, you had to put on pants. Too many steps.
Yeah, it was really cheap back in the day. I actually got that when I was in college. Got to watch a whole bunch of stuff that had been on my watch list a long time, but which I wouldn't have otherwise been able to get. That was actually how I saw Metropolis. Have you ever heard of that?
Metropolis?
That was it was a silent movie, 1920s, made in Germany.
Oh, no, I haven't seen it then.
And it was one of the first ever, I think it was the first ever science fiction film. Maybe somebody in chat knows better, but it was at least one of the first science fiction films.
1927.
1927, there you go. And it was a big budget sci-fi film too. It wasn't something that like half-assed. So it was very influential.
Whoa, this looks awesome.
Oh yeah, it was cool. It can be a little hard to watch because they lost some of the footage over time. But I think like they did manage to reconstruct it, as best they could, and it's pretty watchable. There was actually, since we were talking about anime, there's actually an anime version of that. It's not like a beat for beat recreation. It's not like a remake, but the anime is like very obviously heavily influenced by Metropolis. Yeah, I don't remember what it was called, but it's actually pretty good in its own right. And it's a movie, so you don't have to watch 30 episodes. Yeah, much easier. A much easier watch in that. Oh, it's just called Metropolis. Okay, so never mind. It is the anime Metropolis.
Damn, it says the original movie is 2.5 hours. Fuzzy Cord watched it with the orchestral track that was made for it.
Oh, cool.
I remember going on a big, the top of IMDb quest. I think it was around the time when we were all kind of living together and stuff at UTD. But through means of questionable legality, I went through and I watched, just going top down kind of on the IMDb list of the greatest movies of all time. So I saw some of the old stuff like Citizen Kane, which I never would have randomly watched that. But I was like, okay, I want to see what the fuss is about for these movies. And for a lot of movies, it comes down to the acting and the writing and the story, and how a lot of these stories don't really require the most crisp visuals and graphics. Like if it's a really good story, that's going to be better than good graphics and a bad story.
Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of struggling with that right now.
Yeah.
I started watching an isekai anime, right? Are you familiar with
Yes.
isekai? Yeah.
Konosuba. Let's go. Have you seen that?
So, actually, oh, that's the one you recommended, isn't it? No, I have not seen that.
Yeah, I like that one. It's funny.
Konosuba. Now, the one I've been watching is it's about like a university student who gets summoned to another world, and he has to lead a kingdom.
Hmm.
And the whole anime is just about public policy. How a
Interesting.
realist hero rebuilt the kingdom. That's what it's called.
Huh.
So you can see why I would be interested in it, right? That
Yeah.
kind of caught me eye. So yeah, like the animation is kind of meh, and the action scenes are pretty meh. And
Uh-huh.
honestly, some of the story is pretty meh because it's kind of got some harem anime elements, and that kind of bores me a little bit. I'm not super excited about harem anime.
Uh-huh.
But as far as like the public policy stuff and some of the actual machinations that go into that, I do find that interesting. So that's kind of keeping me going right now, even in spite of some of the other elements.
Nice. We got more recommendations coming in chat. Let's go.
Sorry, I didn't mean to drag out the conclusion here.
I think it's funny. It keeps the segment relatable. You don't want to be too stuffy and highbrow the whole time. We can talk about cartoons too here. Well, cool. Appreciate your time, Mr. Agent Smith. I think we'll wrap it here, but appreciate your expertise as always. And thank you, chat, for weighing in. And also, chat, be sure to calm the fuck down next time a little bit. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for helping handle questions. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.